In Victorian England, marriage was presented as a safe harbor, a quiet promise of belonging, stability, and love. But the moment the vows were spoken, the law rewrote a woman's existence. This is the calm, unsettling history of the rules no one talked about and the lives that slowly disappeared because of them. On the surface, Victorian England appears carefully composed, almost tranquil. It is a world preserved in sepia tones. Gas lamps glowing through evening mist, orderly streets lined with brick terraces, ticking clocks in respectable parlors, and framed family portraits staring solemnly from the walls. History books often linger here, enchanted by manners, industry, and progress. But beneath this polished stillness lived a quieter reality, one rarely named, rarely confronted, and almost never spoken aloud by those trapped inside it. For a woman in the 19th century, marriage was not simply a personal milestone. It was a point of no return, a legal threshold that, once crossed, altered her existence so completely that modern minds struggle to recognize it as anything but erasure. The Victorian nightmare was not dramatic in the way stories often imagine nightmares to be. There were no sudden screams, no obvious villains lurking in dark corners. Instead, it unfolded politely, lawfully, and with the full blessing of church and state. To understand this nightmare, one must first abandon the comforting myth that Victorian marriage was merely unequal or unfair. Inequality implies imbalance. This was something more absolute. Marriage functioned as a transformation, quiet, irreversible, and total. The woman who entered it did not simply gain a husband. She lost herself. The day began innocently enough. Bells rung, guests gathered, silk brushed stone floors. A young woman stood at the threshold of a church, often barely past adolescence, taught since childhood that this moment defined success, safety, and virtue. She was told she was lucky. She was told she was chosen. She was told this was love. What she was not told was that the law was already preparing to absorb her. The Victorian legal system did not view marriage as a partnership between equals. It viewed it as a consolidation. Two individuals entered. One legal entity emerged, and that entity was male. From the moment vows were spoken, the woman's independent legal existence was suspended. Not paused, not diminished. Suspended entirely. This disappearance did not announce itself loudly. There were no declarations, no documents handed to the bride explaining what she had lost. The nightmare relied on silence. It relied on traditions so old it felt natural, and laws so entrenched they felt invisible. A woman might not realize what had happened to her until weeks or months later, when she tried to make a decision and discovered she no longer had the authority to do so. Victorian society thrived on appearances. Respectability was everything, and marriage was its cornerstone. An unmarried woman existed in a precarious state, tolerated but pitied, watched closely for moral failure. Marriage promised protection from that scrutiny, yet the protection came at a cost so complete it was rarely questioned, especially by those who benefited from it. In pamphlets, sermons, and etiquette manuals, marriage was framed as a woman's highest calling. Obedience was described as harmony. Dependence was renamed security. Silence was rebranded as grace. Language itself worked to soften the truth, to lull women into acceptance before the law ever needed to intervene. The nightmare did not begin with cruelty. It began with certainty. Certainty that men knew best. Certainty that women required governance. certainty that order depended on hierarchy. These assumptions were not fringe beliefs, they were foundational. Judges, lawmakers, and clergy repeated them until they became unchallengeable facts rather than opinions. Even those women who entered marriage with education, talent, or wealth found themselves stripped of agency. Intelligence did not protect them. Money did not protect them. Reputation did not protect them. The law recognized only marital status, and once that status changed, everything else became irrelevant. What makes this system especially chilling is how ordinary it was. This was not an emergency measure, nor a temporary injustice born of crises. It was the default. Millions of women lived entire lives inside it, raising children, managing households, enduring hardships while legally existing as shadows. The nightmare was also generational. Daughters watched their mothers navigate marriage with caution and resignation. Warnings were whispered, never stated outright. Advice focused on endurance rather than escape. There was no language for injustice, only for survival. And yet, within this quiet suffering, something else existed. Awareness, not always articulated, not always shared, but deeply felt. Women sensed the wrongness long before they could name it. They felt it in moments when decisions were taken from their hands, when letters went unanswered, when their words carried no legal weight. This introduction is not meant to shock with spectacle, but to prepare the listener for recognition. The Victorian nightmare was not built from chains or locked doors, but from laws written calmly, enforced politely, and defended as moral necessity. It was a system that required no cruelty to function, only compliance. As we move forward, deeper into the specific rules and consequences of Victorian marriage, it is important to remember this beginning, not as a single moment, but as an atmosphere, a slow realization. A world where a woman could be present in every room, yet officially absent from her own life. And so, with the wedding bells still echoing faintly in the background, we step further inside this legal and social labyrinth toward the illusion of romance that concealed the true cost of saying, I do. The illusion of romance. The true cost of a wedding. Dia Victorian. Wedding was a public celebration, but its true consequences unfolded privately and permanently. The bride entered the ceremony as an individual in the eyes of the law, and exited as something entirely different. Friends admired her dress. Guests applauded her future. Yet none of them spoke of the legal transaction taking place beneath the rituals. Marriage transferred authority wholesale. What appeared to be a union of love was, in legal terms, an absorption. The husband gained rights. The wife lost them. Romance served as the soft cover for a system that relied on silence and tradition to survive. Many women discovered the price of the wedding day only after it had passed, when decisions were made without them. Assets moved beyond their reach, and resistance became legally meaningless. The legal death. Unpacking the doctrine of coverture. The heart of Victorian marriage law stood coverture, a doctrine inherited from English common law. Under coverture, a married woman's legal identity was covered by her husband's. In practical terms, this meant she no longer existed as a separate legal person. Courts described husband and wife as one entity, but that entity was always male. A married woman could not own property independently, enter contracts, or represent herself in court. The law treated her as legally dormant, alive only through her husband's authority. This was not metaphorical language. Judges openly referred to a wife's civil death. Wife as property. Why her? Identity legally vanished. Once married, a woman's identity merged into her husband's name, status, and control. She could not sign documents, lease property, or make binding agreements. Even her physical presence was considered under his authority. The law assumed male guardianship was both natural and necessary. This erasure extended beyond paperwork. Social norms reinforced legal silence, discouraging wives from public speech or independent action. A woman who attempted to assert herself risked social punishment alongside legal futility. The system ensured compliance, not through constant force, but through the normalization of disappearance. Financial eradication. What happened to her inheritance and savings? Any money a woman brought into inheritances, savings automatically fell under her husband's control. Even wealth earned before marriage became inaccessible to her. The law assumed men would manage finances wisely. It offered no safeguards if they did not. If a husband squandered his wife's inheritance, she had no legal recourse. Poverty, once imposed, became permanent. Wealth did not protect women from coverture. It often made them more vulnerable to exploitation. The husband's claim, where did a working woman's wages go? Some Victorian women worked before marriage. Many continued out of necessity. Yet any wages they earned belonged, by law, to their husbands. A working wife could labor long hours, only to see her earnings legally seized. This rule trapped women in a paradox, expected to contribute financially, yet denied financial agency. Economic dependence was not merely cultural, it was enforced by statute. Independence became impossible by design. The silence of the law. Why married women could not sue or be sued. Married women could not initiate lawsuits or defend themselves in court. Any legal action had to be brought by your against the husband. This made justice inaccessible, especially in cases of abuse, fraud, or theft. The law's silence was strategic. By denying wives a legal voice, the system ensured grievances remained private and unresolved. Courts did not hear women because, legally, women were not there. The trapped woman. The cycle of abuse with no financial escape. Abuse within marriage was notoriously difficult to escape. Divorce was rare, expensive, and socially ruinous. Without access to money or property, many women simply could not leave. The law offered protection in theory, but survival required resources women were denied. Marriage became a closed system, easy to enter, nearly impossible to exit. The cruelest rule. Why mothers had no rights to their own children under Victorian law. Children belonged entirely to the father. If a marriage collapsed, a mother could be permanently separated from her children, regardless of her conduct or devotion. This rule enforced obedience through fear. A woman who left risked losing everything that mattered most. A glimpse of resistance. The story of Caroline Norton. Karali Norton was educated, articulate, and well-connected, and still powerless under the law. When her abusive husband took her children, she discovered how absolute paternal rights truly were. Rather than retreat, Norton wrote, she published pamphlets, letters, and appeals that echoed the illusion of romance. The true cost of a wedding day. The Victorian wedding day was designed to be unforgettable. It unfolded with deliberate beauty, every detail carefully chosen to signal harmony, prosperity, and moral order. Churches filled with soft light filtered through stained glass. Flowers lined the aisles. Guests whispered approvingly as the bride appeared. Pale and composed, her future imagined as something gentle and secure. To those watching, this was not merely a ceremony. It was reassurance made visible. Yet what made the wedding day so powerful was not its joy, but its performance. It was a ritual meant to convince everyone present, especially the bride herself, that something benevolent was taking place. Romance was not an afterthought, it was the shield. Love softened what law would soon enforce. From childhood, Victorian women were prepared for this moment. Stories, sermons, and novels framed marriage as destiny. Courtship was portrayed as a careful dance, leading inevitably toward vows that would complete a woman's purpose. Happiness, safety, and respectability were promised as rewards for obedience and patience. Very little was said about what marriage required in return. On the morning of the wedding, the bride still possessed a legal identity. She could, in theory, own property, inherit money, or make limited contracts. This fact was rarely emphasized, because by nightfall it would no longer be true. The ceremony itself acted as a boundary line. Before and after, though no visible marker announced the crossing, as vows were spoken, language of unity filled the air. Two lives becoming one. Two hearts joined. These phrases sounded poetic, even sacred. But in legal terms, unity meant absorption. The law did not imagine a blending of equals. It recognized only a transfer. The illusion lay in the idea of mutual exchange. The husband appeared to give protection. The wife appeared to give companionship. But protection was not legally enforceable. While obedience was, love could be expected, but control was guaranteed. Guests celebrated, unwilling to acknowledge that the bride's future autonomy had just quietly expired. No document was read aloud. No warning was issued. The law required no disclosure because the system relied on assumption rather than consent. Everyone already believed this was how marriage worked. The wedding breakfast followed. Toasts were raised. Advice was offered lightly, often cloaked in humor. Marriage is about compromise, elders would say, smiling knowingly. What they meant was rarely explained. Compromise suggested negotiation. Marriage, as the law defined it, allowed none. For many women, the first realization came later, in moments so ordinary they felt surreal. A letter that needed signing, a decision involving money, a question of residence or travel. The answer, delivered politely, was always the same. This was no longer hers to decide. Romance had done its work well. It delayed awareness. It reframed loss as virtue. A woman who felt unease was encouraged to doubt herself rather than the system. Love, she was told, required sacrifice. Silence was proof of devotion. Victorian culture praised the submissive wife as an ideal. Popular literature celebrated women who endured quietly, who absorbed disappointment without complaint. These stories did not present obedience as oppression, but as moral beauty. The wedding day was the narrative climax, the reward for compliance. Yet beneath these ideals ran a quieter truth. Marriage was irreversible for most women. Divorce existed, but it was ruinously expensive and socially devastating. A woman who questioned her wedding day decision found herself trapped not by emotion alone, but by law. Even women who married for affection discovered that love offered no protection against legal reality. A kind husband might choose to consult his wife. An unkind one was under no obligation to do so. Rights that depended on goodwill were not rights at all. The cost of the wedding day was not paid immediately. It accrued slowly, compounding over years. Each small surrender made the next easier, until resistance felt unnatural. What began as romance settled into routine dependency. And because this process was gradual, it rarely inspired rebellion at first. There was no single moment of betrayal, only a growing awareness that something essential had been traded away, something no one had thought to name. The illusion endured because it was comforting. It allowed society to celebrate weddings without confronting their consequences. It allowed men to inherit authority without acknowledging its origin. It allowed the law to remain unquestioned, hidden behind flowers and vows. By the end of the wedding day, the transformation was complete. The bride retired not only from public celebration, the legal death, unpacking the doctrine of coverture. On the morning a Victorian woman married, there was no bell rung to announce her disappearance, no official seal pressed into wax to mark an ending. The church doors closed softly behind her, and the world continued exactly as it had the day before. To neighbors and family, she was still visible, laughing politely, adjusting her gloves, stepping into a carriage beside her husband. But in the quiet language of the law, she had just died. This death was neither poetic nor symbolic. It was precise, deliberate, and legal. Its name was coverture, a doctrine inherited from centuries of English common law, designed to transform marriage into a legal fusion where only one identity remained intact. The wife did not vanish physically. She vanished juridically. Her existence was absorbed into that of her husband, not as a partner, but as an extension. From that moment forward, the law recognized only one person in the marriage, and that person was male. The word coverture came from the French couvrir, meaning to cover. Jurists spoke of it as a form of protection, a legal shelter under which a woman would live, guided and represented by her husband. But protection implied choice, and coverture allowed none. The covering was absolute. It did not ask whether the woman was capable, intelligent, or independent. It did not weigh the character of the man she married. It operated automatically, as unthinking as gravity before marriage. A woman's legal status, while constrained, was not entirely void. An unmarried woman could inherit money or land. She could, under certain conditions, sign contracts, manage property, and be held accountable in court. She could earn wages in her own name, however small, and decide how they were spent. Society watched her closely, judged her harshly, and restricted her ambitions, but the law still recognized her as a person. Marriage erased that recognition in an instant. Under coverture, husband and wife became a single, legal entity. This unity was described as harmonious, even sacred. Yet unity did not mean equality. The law did not imagine two wills acting together. It imagined one will commanding and the other yielding. The wife's legal voice was silenced, not because she had spoken wrongly, but because she was no longer permitted to speak at all. Her husband spoke for her. Whether he understood her wishes or not, property offered the clearest demonstration of this erasure. Any money a woman brought into the marriage inheritance, savings, gifts passed directly into her husband's control. Len followed the same path. Even items of personal significance, such as jewelry or household furnishings, were legally his to manage, sell, or discard. This transfer required no document beyond the marriage certificate itself. Love, in this context, functioned as a deed of ownership. Wages followed the same logic. If a married woman worked, her earnings belonged not to her, but to her husband. Employers paid him directly or assumed his authority over her income. A woman could labor for long hours, contribute significantly to a household's survival, and still have no legal claim to the money she earned. The law treated her effort as an extension of her husband's productivity. not as proof of her independence. The courts reinforced this silence with unwavering consistency. A married woman could not sue in her own name. If she were wronged, defrauded, assaulted, or abandoned, she required her husband's cooperation to seek justice. If he refused, the case died where it stood. Similarly, she could not be sued independently. Any legal responsibility passed through her husband, absolving her not out of mercy, but because the law did not acknowledge her as a separate legal actor. This absence had profound consequences. Without the ability to enter contracts, a woman could not lease property, start a business, or make binding agreements on her own behalf. Without standing in court, she could not defend her reputation or protect her interests. Her dependency was not merely economic, it was institutional. The law constructed a world in which escape was nearly impossible, not through force alone, but through structure. Even her physical autonomy existed in a legal gray area. While the law stopped short of explicitly naming a wife as property, it granted husbands extensive authority over their wives' bodies. Marital consent was assumed to be permanent, a condition of the wedding vows rather than an ongoing choice. Acts that would have been criminal outside marriage were dismissed within it as private matters. Coverture did not merely ignore harm, it normalized it. What made this doctrine particularly insidious was its quietness. Coverture did not require constant enforcement. It was embedded into the fabric of everyday life, into bank transactions, court procedures, employment practices, and inheritance laws. A clerk did not need to ask whether a woman had legal standing. Her marital status answered the question automatically. The system functioned smoothly, precisely because it erased her without spectacle. Most women entered marriage without fully understanding this legal transformation. The doctrine was rarely explained in plain terms. It existed in legal texts, not in courtship conversations. Engagements were filled with promises of affection and partnership, not warnings of disappearance. Young brides assumed that love would temper authority, that kindness would replace power. The law made no such assumptions. For women who found themselves in unhappy or violent marriages, coverture became a locked door. Without control over money, they could not save to leave. Without legal identity, they could not act independently in court. Separation, when it occurred, often deepened their vulnerability, leaving them socially condemned and financially ruined. The law, designed to maintain order, preserved suffering instead. Yet society rarely named this system as cruel. It was framed as tradition, supported by religious interpretations that emphasized obedience and sacrifice. Judges cited precedent with calm assurance. Newspapers treated coverture as an unremarkable feature of married life. Mothers warned daughters to choose wisely, not to challenge the rules themselves. In this way, injustice disguised itself as normalcy. Still, beneath this legal burial, something resisted. Women wrote letters to lawmakers, recorded their experiences in private journals, and shared stories in hushed conversations. Some began to articulate a dangerous idea, that marriage should not require the extinction of self. That unity did not have to mean hierarchy, that a woman did not stop being a person because she became a wife. At this stage in the story, however, such thoughts remained fragile, scattered, and often unheard. Coverture stood firm, defended by centuries of precedent and the full authority of the state. The law had declared its position with chilling clarity. The married woman was not absent by accident. She had been deliberately removed. And yet, this legal death was not the end of the story. It was the condition that shaped everything that followed. Every loss, every protest, every slow step toward reform. The silence imposed by coverture would eventually provoke voices that refused to stay quiet. But those voices had not yet gathered their strength. For now, the doctrine remained intact, heavy and unquestioned, pressing down on millions of lives. Marriage closed around women like a final sentence, spoken softly enforced completely, and rarely challenged aloud. Wife as property. Why her identity legally vanished. The moment a Victorian woman crossed from fiancée to wife, the law altered the meaning of her existence. It did not do so loudly or cruelly on the surface. There were no chains, no declarations of ownership read aloud in courtrooms or churches. Instead, her transformation unfolded through paperwork, precedent, and quiet assumptions that had been repeated for generations. She did not belong to herself anymore, and the law did not consider this a loss. In legal language, marriage was described as a transfer not of affection or responsibility, but of authority. The wife's legal identity did not coexist with her husband's. It dissolved into it. This dissolution was so complete that jurists struggled to explain it without resorting to metaphor. They spoke of unity, of oneness, of harmony within the household. Yet behind these comforting words stood a simpler truth. The wife became something to be managed, not someone to be heard. Property law revealed this reality most clearly. Under Victorian legal doctrine, property was not merely land or money. It was anything that could be controlled, exchanged, or directed by another's will. Once married, a woman's possessions, whether earned, inherited, or gifted, fell under this definition. Her belongings did not follow her into marriage as protected extensions of her selfhood. They followed her husband as assets attached to his authority. Even her name began to lose its weight. While not always legally erased, it became functionally irrelevant. Documents identified her through her husband, not as an individual. She was Mrs. John Smith, not a person with a separate past or future. The law did not require her biography. It required only his. Her story mattered insofar as it intersected with his ownership. This legal framing shaped how institutions treated married women. Banks refused to recognize their signatures. Employers deferred to husbands regarding wages. Courts dismissed testimonies that came from wives without male endorsement. The system did not question whether a woman was capable of understanding her own affairs. Capability was beside the point. Authority had already been assigned. What made this particularly devastating was that it applied regardless of a woman's background. An educated woman lost her standing as surely as one without schooling. A wealthy heiress surrendered control as completely as a working-class bride. Intelligence, experience, and contribution offered no protection. Marriage flattened all distinctions, reducing womanhood to a single legal category defined by dependence. The logic behind this arrangement rested on a belief that a household required one master. Victorian lawmakers argued that divided authority would lead to chaos, that two legal identities within a marriage would create conflict. Order, they insisted, demanded hierarchy. The wife's submission was portrayed not as injustice, but as necessity. Her disappearance was framed as a functional design, choice, rather than a moral failing. Yet the law went further than simply granting husbands control over property. It treated a wife's labor, time, and obedience as expected resources. Her domestic work was unpaid and unrecognized, yet legally presumed. Caregiving, housekeeping, and emotional labor were not viewed as contributions deserving autonomy or compensation. They were obligations attached to her new status, duties owed, not efforts offered. Even decisions about movement and residence, reflected this ownership. A husband could decide where the family lived, and the law supported his authority to do so. If a wife refused to follow him, she risked being labeled disobedient or immoral. Her physical presence became something he could demand, not something she could negotiate. The concept of personal freedom narrowed sharply at the altar. In cases of conflict, this imbalance became dangerous. A wife who challenged her husband's authority found herself without legal tools. She could not control finances, secure property, or act independently in court. Resistance carried consequences, while compliance was rewarded with basic security. The law did not need to threaten her constantly. It had already stripped away alternatives. Children further complicated this erasure. Although a wife bore them, nurtured them, and shaped their early lives, the law regarded them as belonging to the father. A mother's connection was emotional, not legal. In disputes, her claims carried little weight. The idea that a woman could be central to a child's life yet have no recognized authority over that life revealed how completely her identity had been subordinated. Public discourse rarely described this system as ownership. That word felt too harsh, too revealing. Instead, writers and judges spoke of guardianship and protection. They insisted that women benefited from male authority, that dependence ensured safety. But protection without consent and guardianship without accountability blurred easily into control. The law offered wives shelter only so long as they remained compliant. Many women internalized these expectations, believing that surrender was the price of respectability. To be a good wife was to be invisible, in certain ways to defer, to endure, to adapt. Questioning this arrangement risked social isolation and moral condemnation. Silence became both a survival strategy and a learned habit, passed down like an inheritance. Still, beneath this imposed quiet, tension accumulated. Letters preserved in archives reveal women who understood, often with painful clarity, what they had lost. Diaries speak of frustration, anger, and disbelief at how thoroughly marriage erased legal selfhood. These writings rarely reached the public eye, but they documented a growing awareness that something fundamental had been taken. At this point in the story, however, the law remained unmoved. Courts upheld precedent. Legislators defended tradition. Society continued to treat wives as extensions rather than individuals. The structure of ownership endured, reinforced daily by practice and expectation. Yet this condition was not static. Pressure, once applied, rarely disappears. The belief that a wife could be reduced to property would eventually face resistance lay uneven and costly. The idea that identity could vanish at marriage would be questioned, challenged, and redefined. But that reckoning had not yet arrived. For now, the Victorian wife lived within a legal framework that denied her separateness, wrapped her life in someone else's authority, and called that arrangement order. What that denial would mean in moments of crisis when love failed, when money ran out, when children were taken belongs to the chapter still unfolding. Financial eradication, what happened to her inheritance and savings, money in Victorian society was more than currency. It was power, safety, and voice. It determined where one could live, how one could move, and whether one could say no. For a woman entering marriage, this power did not merely shift hands, it vanished from hers entirely. The law did not view this as confiscation. It viewed it as correction. A woman might arrive at marriage with a carefully assembled financial life. Perhaps she had inherited a modest sum from a parent, saved wages from years of work, or received a dowry intended to secure her future. These funds represented not luxury, but security money set aside for illness, widowhood, or old age. Yet the moment vows were spoken, these resources ceased to be hers in any legal sense. Under the rules of coverture, a married woman's movable property cash, savings, investments, jewelry automatically transferred to her husband. There was no requirement for consent, no acknowledgement of intent. The law assumed the transfer as naturally as it assumed the change of her name. What had once functioned as a financial foundation became part of his estate. Inheritance followed a similarly unforgiving logic. If a woman inherited money after marriage, it did not strengthen her independence. It strengthened her husband's position. Estates left 2 daughters, with the hope of protecting them, were absorbed into their husband's control. Unless specific, carefully constructed legal barriers had been arranged in advance. Most families did not understand these mechanisms, and many could not afford them. Good intentions dissolved in legal reality. Savings, too, were rendered meaningless as instruments of self-determination. A woman could not open a bank account in her own name once married. If she deposited money, it was assumed to belong to her husband. Withdrawals required his approval. Even if she earned the money herself through teaching, sewing, writing, or factory work, the law treated those earnings as his property. Her labor did not generate independence. It reinforced dependence. This financial erasure was often justified as efficiency. Lawmakers argued that unified control prevented confusion and conflict within marriage. They insisted that a household, like a business, required a single manager. What they did not acknowledge was that this model stripped women of the very tools needed to protect themselves from mismanagement, neglect, or cruelty. The consequences became painfully clear when marriages soured. A woman whose husband squandered her inheritance had no legal recourse. If he gambled it away, invested recklessly, or drank it into oblivion, the loss was legally his to incur. She could protest, plead, or suffer in silence, but she could not intervene. The money was no longer hers to save. For women in abusive marriages, this financial dependency was devastating. Without access to funds, escape was nearly impossible. Travel required money. Legal action required money. Even temporary separation demanded resources for housing and food. By stripping women of financial control, the law quietly ensured their physical confinement as well. Widowhood did not always restore what marriage had taken. If a husband died, a woman's access to property depended on wills, settlements, and surviving male relatives. Some widows regained partial control, but others found themselves dependent once more, this time on sons or trustees. Marriage did not simply pause a woman's financial identity. It often permanently altered its trajectory. The irony was stark. Society praised women for thrift, prudence, and sacrifice. They were expected to manage households efficiently, stretch limited resources, and prepare for emergencies. Yet the law denied them authority over the very finances they were responsible for stewarding. Responsibility existed without power, accountability without control. This system also affected how families planned marriages. Parents often focused less on their daughter's future security and more on the respectability of the match. Once married, her financial well-being was considered settled, not because she was protected, but because she was no longer expected to need protection of her own. Any failure was attributed to personal misfortune, not structural design. Some families attempted to shield their daughters through trusts and marriage settlements, legal instruments that allowed property to be managed separately, but these arrangements were complex, costly, and far from guaranteed. They depended on male relatives to establish and enforce them. Protection, once again, was conditional and external. For working-class women, the situation was even more precarious. With little inheritance to lose, their wages became the primary site of erasure. A woman might work long hours in factories, fields, or homes, only to see her earnings claimed by her husband. The law did not distinguish between contribution and ownership. Work did not equal control. The psychological impact of this financial annihilation was profound. Women described feelings of helplessness, humiliation, and anxiety. To know that one's future depended entirely on another's goodwill was a constant burden. Every disagreement carried economic risk. Every act of defiance threatened survival. Yet public discussion rarely framed this as injustice. Financial dependence was presented as natural, even virtuous. Independence in women was treated with suspicion, as a threat to social order. The loss of money was recast as the gain of protection, though many women discovered that protection could be withdrawn at any time. Despite this silence, cracks began to form. Stories circulated of women left destitute after husbands misused their assets. Reformers collected examples, not as abstract arguments, but as lived realities. The idea that marriage erased a woman's financial existence began to trouble those willing to look closely. At this stage in the narrative, however, the system still held firm. Inheritance continued to flow away from women. Savings continued to dissolve into male control. The law remained unmoved by individual suffering, focused instead on preserving structure and tradition. But financial erasure has a way of leaving evidence. Empty accounts, lost homes, and broken futures cannot be hidden forever. The question of who controlled women's money would eventually force itself into public debate, challenging the assumption that dependence was destiny. That challenge, slow and contested, belongs to what comes next. For now, the Victorian wife stood economically erased, her past absorbed, her future mortgaged, and her security placed entirely in someone else's hands. The husband's claim. Where did a working woman's wages go? Work did not save a Victorian woman from dependence. In fact, for many married women, labor only deepened the illusion of independence while leaving the legal reality unchanged. She could rise before dawn, return home exhausted, and place her earnings on the kitchen table, yet none of that money legally belonged to her. The law did not deny that she worked. It simply denied that her work created ownership under cover. A married woman's wages were not considered the product of her individual effort. They were treated as an extension of her husband's economic activity, regardless of whether he had lifted a finger. This principle applied across class lines. Factory workers, domestic servants, seamstresses, shop assistants, teachers all surrendered their earnings the moment they married. Employment did not grant autonomy. Marriage revoked it. The logic behind this claim rested on the idea of marital unity. If husband and wife were one legal person, then income produced by either belonged to that single entity. Since the law recognized the husband as the representative of that entity, he controlled the money. This reasoning was presented as neutral and rational, but its consequences were profoundly uneven. The wife bore the physical cost of labor. The husband received the legal benefit. In practice, this meant that employers often paid married women's wages directly to their husbands. In some cases, a husband was required to give written permission for his wife to work at all. Her employment contract, when it existed, acknowledged his authority over her income. Even when wages passed briefly through her hands, they did so as a courtesy, not as a right. For working-class families, this arrangement was especially visible. Many households depended on women's earnings to survive. Wives worked in mills, laundries, and fields, contributing essential income. Yet, the law framed these contributions as supplemental rather than essential, reinforcing the notion that a man was the true breadwinner even when evidence suggested otherwise. The story the law told mattered more than the reality it ignored. This legal claim over wages shaped power dynamics within the home. Control over money determined decisions: what food was bought, how rent was paid, whether children were sent to school or work. A woman who earned but could not control her wages found herself responsible for outcomes she could not direct. Blame and authority became dangerously misaligned. For some husbands, this power was exercised with restraint. They allowed wives to manage household funds, treating their earnings as shared resources. But this arrangement depended entirely on goodwill. The law offered no protection if that goodwill vanished. A husband could seize wages without explanation, spend them recklessly, or withhold money as punishment. His authority required no justification. The consequences of this imbalance became stark in moments of conflict. If a woman sought to leave an unhappy marriage, her earnings could not finance escape. Money she had earned could be reclaimed by her husband, legally and immediately. Even the act of saving was fraught with risk. Hidden coins or secret accounts, when discovered, could be taken without consequence. The system also discouraged women from asserting pride in their labor. Work was framed as duty rather than achievement. A wife who emphasized her contribution risked being labeled unfeminine or defiant. Gratitude was expected, not recognition. The law reinforced this cultural message by denying legal ownership over wages. Children absorbed these lessons early. Daughters watched mothers work without reward, learning that effort did not guarantee agency. Sons learned that authority over money could be inherited through status rather than earned through labor. The wage system within marriage became a quiet classroom, teaching hierarchy without formal instruction. For middle-class women, wage loss took subtler forms. Many engaged in unpaid labor, assisting in family businesses, managing rentals, or contributing intellectual work, such as writing or translation. When money resulted, it was attributed to husbands or male relatives. Authorship was obscured. Contribution became invisible. The line between work and obligation blurred until it disappeared. Attempts to challenge this arrangement were rare and risky. A woman who demanded control over her wages risked legal retaliation or social condemnation. Courts consistently upheld a husband's right to his wife's earnings, citing precedent and marital unity. Each ruling reinforced the message that labor did not equal independence for women. This claim over wages also shaped how society valued women's work. Because their earnings were not legally theirs, their labor was considered less significant. Wages controlled by men were seen as productive. Wages earned by women were seen as auxiliary. The law did not merely reflect this belief, it created it. Yet, as industrialization expanded, the number of working women grew. Factories relied on female labor. Cities depended on women's service work. The contradiction between economic reality and legal fiction became harder to ignore. Women were indispensable to the workforce, yet legally absent from its rewards. Some reformers began to question this imbalance. They asked how a society could depend on women's labor while denying them ownership of its fruits. They pointed to cases where women supported entire households, only to remain legally powerless within them. These questions did not yet reshape the law, but they planted seeds of doubt. At this point in the story, however, the husband's claim remained absolute. Wages flowed upward, authority flowed inward, and women's labor continued to sustain systems that refused to recognize them as economic actors. Work offered exhaustion, not escape. Still, money leaves traces. Receipts, pay ledgers, factory records all bore silent witness to women as contributions. Over time, these traces accumulated into evidence that could not be entirely dismissed. The question of wages would become central to debates about marriage, identity, and justice. But that reckoning lay ahead. For now, the working wife stood in a cruel paradox, earning daily, owning nothing, and supporting a structure that denied her economic existence. The silence of the law. Why married women could not sue or be sued. Silence, in Victorian law, was not always the absence of sound. Sometimes it was a deliberate refusal to listen. For married women, the courtroom embodied this silence with chilling precision. They could stand at its threshold, present in body and voice, yet absent in authority. The law did not deny their experiences. It denied their existence as legal speakers. Under the doctrine of coverture, a married woman was not recognized as a separate legal person. Because the law imagined husband and wife as a single entity, it followed that only one voice could speak for that entity. That voice belonged to the husband. This principle did not merely limit a woman's rights, it erased her legal presence entirely, rendering her incapable of initiating or defending legal action on her own behalf. To sue someone was to assert that one had been wronged and deserved remedy. To be sued was to be held accountable for one's actions. Both acts required legal personhood. A married woman possessed neither. If she were defrauded, injured, or betrayed, the law required her husband to bring the case. If he refused out of indifference, fear, or malista, matter ended. Justice was not delayed. It was denied. This dependency extended even to the most personal harms. If a woman was assaulted, her suffering did not automatically grant her standing in court. The offense was framed as an injury to her husband's interests, not her own body. Legal language spoke of damage to male property rather than violation of female autonomy. The woman's pain became secondary, filtered through a male claim. The inability to be sued carried its own distortions. A married woman could not be held independently responsible for debts or contractual obligations. At first glance, this appeared protective. In reality, it reinforced her invisibility. Responsibility passed to her husband, not as an act of mercy, but because the law refused to acknowledge her capacity for agency. She was exempt from accountability because she was excluded from recognition. This exclusion shaped everyday interactions with the state. If a married woman signed a contract, it was void unless her husband endorsed it. If she attempted to defend herself in a legal dispute, her testimony carried no independent weight. Even her written words, statements, affidavits were treated as extensions of her husband's will or dismissed entirely. Courtrooms, symbols of order and fairness, thus became spaces of erasure. A woman could describe her situation to a lawyer, recounting injustice in detail, only to be told that nothing could be done without her husband's cooperation. The law did not ask whether this requirement was fair. It asked only whether it was consistent with precedent. This silence had profound implications for power within marriage. Knowing that his wife could not act independently in court, a husband possessed a form of legal immunity. He could withhold consent for legal action, block access to representation, and manipulate proceedings to his advantage. The law did not need to endorse cruelty explicitly. It enabled it structurally. For women seeking separation or protection, this barrier was nearly insurmountable. Without the ability to sue, a wife could not easily claim maintenance, recover property, or challenge custody decisions. Her legal voice was muffled at precisely the moment she needed it most. Silence became a tool of containment. The psychological toll of this enforced quiet was immense. To know that one's grievances were legally inaudible fostered resignation and despair. Many women learned not to articulate injustice, because articulation led nowhere. Over time, silence became internalized, shaping how women understood their own worth and expectations. Public justification for this system rested on paternalism. Lawmakers argued that husbands represented their wives' interests and that allowing women independent legal standing would disrupt marital harmony. Conflict, they warned, would spill into courts, undermining the family unit. Silence was framed as peace, yet this peace was one-sided. It protected male authority while exposing women to unchecked power. The law's refusal to hear women did not eliminate conflict. It concealed it. Domestic disputes did not disappear because they were unspoken. They festered unresolved and unaddressed. Some women attempted to work around this silence by appealing to public opinion. They wrote pamphlets, letters to newspapers, and petitions to Parliament. These efforts were acts of desperation rather than strategy, attempts to be heard outside a system that refused to listen within. Success was rare, but awareness grew. Occasionally, sympathetic judges stretched the limits of the law, allowing limited forms of testimony or intervention. These moments were exceptions that proved the rule. Each required extraordinary circumstances and male advocacy. Ordinary women could not rely on such mercy. As the 19th century progressed, contradictions became harder to ignore. Industrialization, urbanization, and social reform movements expanded women's roles in public life. Women managed businesses, supported families, and participated in civic causes, yet the law continued to treat them as legally mute. Once married, the gap between lived reality and legal fiction widened. Critics began to ask uncomfortable questions. How could a society that prided itself on justice silence half its population? How could responsibility be demanded without rights, obedience without voice? These questions did not immediately change the law, but they unsettled its moral authority. At this point in the narrative, however, the silence endured. Married women remained unable to sue or be sued, locked out of the very mechanisms designed to resolve disputes and protect rights. The law's refusal persisted, shaping lives through absence rather than decree. But silence, once recognized, becomes harder to justify. The awareness that the law was not neutral, but actively excluding women, would fuel future challenges. The courtroom would eventually be forced to listen. That confrontation, however, still lay ahead. For now, the married woman's voice echoed unheard, present in suffering, absent in law, and waiting for a moment when silence itself would be put on trial. The trapped woman. The cycle of abuse with no financial escape. Abuse in Victorian marriage rarely announced itself with spectacle. It did not always begin with blows or shouting. More often, it arrived quietly through control, restriction, and the steady tightening of dependence. The law did not name these actions as abuse. It called them authority. For countless married women, this distinction made escape not merely difficult, but structurally impossible. A woman could recognize cruelty and still have nowhere to go. She might understand that her marriage had become dangerous, degrading, or unbearable, yet remain legally bound to the very person causing her harm. This was not a failure of courage. It was the consequence of a system that removed every practical path to independence long before abuse began. Financial dependence lay at the center of this trap. Without control over money, a woman could not secure housing, transportation, or legal help. Every step away from her husband required resources she did not possess. Even small acts of resistance carried risk. If she attempted to save secretly, discovery meant confiscation. If she sought work, her wages could be claimed. The law did not merely fail to protect her, it enforced her captivity. Abusive husbands understood this power well. Control over finances became a tool of domination, used to reward obedience and punish defiance. Money was withheld, rationed, or dangled as leverage. The wife's survival food, clothing, care for, children depended on compliance. Violence did not need to be constant. The threat of deprivation was often enough. Physical abuse, when it occurred, existed within a legal gray zone. Victorian law drew a line between correction and cruelty, a line defined loosely and enforced inconsistently. Moderate violence was often tolerated, dismissed as a private matter. Severe harm required proof, witnesses, and male advocacy resources most women lacked. The burden of evidence fell on those least able to produce it. Emotional and psychological abuse were not recognized at all. Humiliation, isolation, and intimidation were invisible to the law. A husband who controlled his wife's movements, correspondence, or relationships acted within his perceived rights. The erosion of a woman's sense of self was not considered a legal injury. Suffering that left no bruises, left no case. For women with children, the trap tightened further. Leaving an abusive husband risked losing access to sons and daughters. The law favored paternal authority, treating children as extensions of the father's household. A mother who fled without permission could be accused of desertion or immorality. Love became a liability. Protection of children required submission to the system harming them. Society offered little refuge. Shelters, as we understand them today, did not exist. Family members often urged patience, endurance, and silence. A woman who spoke openly about marital abuse risked social ruin. Respectability demanded discretion. Suffering in private was framed as virtue. Seeking help was framed as failure. Churches reinforced this message. Religious teachings emphasized obedience, sacrifice, and forgiveness. Marriage was portrayed as indissoluble, suffering as sanctifying. Women were encouraged to pray for change rather than demand it. Spiritual counsel rarely challenged legal authority. Faith became another barrier rather than a bridge to safety. Even when separation occurred, it offered no guarantee of relief. A separated woman remained legally married, subject to her husband's control over finances and children. Without formal divorce was expensive, rare, and stigmatized. She existed in limbo. Independence was still out of reach. Dependence simply changed form. The psychological weight of this entrapment was immense. Women described feeling erased, powerless, and unseen. Hope narrowed into endurance. Days became calculations, how to avoid conflict, how to stretch limited funds, how to protect children from witnessing violence. Survival replaced aspiration. Yet the law framed these experiences as individual misfortunes rather than systemic outcomes. Abuse was treated as a matter of character, not structure. A cruel husband was an exception, not evidence of a flawed system. This framing allowed lawmakers to ignore patterns that repeated across class, region, and circumstance. Some women attempted desperate measures. They fled without resources, relying on charity or strangers. Others endured in silence, believing survival was the only option. A few turned to public appeals, writing letters or petitions that exposed their suffering. These acts required extraordinary bravery and often resulted in backlash rather than relief. The absence of financial escape made every choice costly. Staying meant continued harm. Leaving meant destitution, social condemnation, and possible loss of children. The law offered no option that resembled safety. It forced women to choose between different forms of suffering. Despite this, stories accumulated. Court records, asylum admissions, and charitable reports began to reveal patterns too consistent to ignore. Reformers took notice. They argued that legal dependence created conditions ripe for abuse, that financial control was not neutral but dangerous. These arguments challenged the comforting fiction that marriage naturally protected women. At this point in the story, however, such critiques remained marginal. The dominant narrative still framed abuse as private and financial dependence as normal. The system continued to operate as designed, confining women through law rather than locks. But systems built on silence eventually encounter voices they cannot contain. The recognition that abuse was not an anomaly, but a predictable outcome of legal power imbalance would become a turning point. Financial escape would emerge as a central demand, not a personal failing. That demand, still forming, had not yet reached the halls of power. For now, the trapped woman lived within a cycle that renewed itself: daily dependence enabling abuse, abuse reinforcing dependence, and the law standing quietly between her and the possibility of freedom. What happened when mothers realized even their children were not legally theirs would deepen this crisis further, and that reckoning lies just ahead. The cruelest rule: why mothers had no rights to their own children. In Victorian England, motherhood was both a blessing and a trap. For countless women, the act of giving life did not grant the legal authority to protect it. From the moment a child was born, the law drew a sharp line. The father held absolute custody, while the mother's role, however devoted, was legally invisible. It was not a gentle oversight, but a deliberate, structural erasure, embedded in centuries of precedent, cultural expectation, and the doctrine of coverture. A mother could care for her child day and night, feed them, teach them, comfort them through illness, yet the law regarded her devotion as incidental. Her authority was nominal. Her claim to influence or control was null. The father, even if absent, neglectful, or cruel, held ultimate power. The legal system did not recognize nurturing as a right. It recognized only ownership. Children were property, in the eyes of the law, of the man who fathered them. This rule was justified by Victorian legislators and legal theorists through appeals to order, lineage, and inheritance. Fathers were deemed the natural head of the household, the provider, and the representative of the family to the state. Children, it was argued, required guidance and authority that only a father could provide. Emotional bonds, daily caregiving, or maternal expertise were considered secondary to paternal control. The mother's presence was expected, but her voice was legally irrelevant. Women discovered the cruelest dimensions of this rule most painfully in cases of marital conflict. Separation, desertion, or abuse could transform daily life into a nightmare. A mother might leave a home to protect herself, only to find that leaving her children behind was the only legal option. Fathers could remove children entirely from the mother's care, relocate them across counties, and deny any meaningful visitation. Courts rarely intervened, and even sympathetic judges were constrained by rigid statutes. Letters and diaries from this era reveal the emotional devastation mothers experienced. One woman, writing under the pseudonym Margaret H., recounted how she had nursed her sick children through months of fever, only for her husband to legally remove them after a quarrel. Her journal entries capture despair. I am here. They are gone. I gave them life, yet the law calls me nothing. I cannot feed them, cannot comfort them, cannot speak for them. I am a mother in name only. Such narratives were not rare, but emblematic of a systemic injustice. The law's disregard for maternal rights also extended to financial and social influence. A father controlled allowances, clothing, schooling, and household decisions affecting the children, even if a mother had inherited money or contributed significantly to the household. Her ability to direct its use for her children was limited or nullified. The children's daily experience, education, and welfare were filtered through paternal authority, with maternal input treated as optional or informal advice. This framework created a perverse dynamic. Fathers could neglect, abuse, or exploit their children, yet retain custody. Mothers could sacrifice everything for their children's well-being, yet remain powerless to enforce their protection. Many women described a constant state of anxiety, living under the threat of losing their children, even in otherwise stable marriages. The law taught that love and dedication were secondary to legal and social hierarchy. Social and religious norms reinforced these legal boundaries. Women were expected to accept their roles as subordinate within marriage, with obedience equated to virtue. Church teachings emphasized patience, sacrifice, and moral endurance. A mother who challenged paternal authority risked social condemnation, being labeled unfit, immoral, or hysterical. The system discouraged resistance and framed maternal suffering as a natural consequence of proper conduct. Children internalized these dynamics as well. Sons learned that authority over family descended from legal rights, not nurturing or care. Daughters learned that caregiving could be central to life, but powerless in law. Mother's devotion became an invisible curriculum, teaching resilience, discretion, and quiet endurance. The law and social norms conspired to train the next generation to accept this imbalance as inevitable. Despite these restrictions, some women began to fight back. Stories of mothers petitioning courts, writing letters to newspapers, and lobbying legislators illustrate early forms of resistance. One notable case involved a woman named Caroline Norton, whose struggle for access to her children captured public attention. After her estranged husband refused to allow her to see her sons, she leveraged public opinion and political channels to highlight the injustice of the law. Her efforts eventually contributed to the Custody of Infants Act of 1839, which, while limited, recognized for the first time that mothers could have legal claims under certain circumstances. Even with this act, however, progress was partial. Custody rights were restricted by class, social standing, and paternal consent. Only women of certain means and social influence could hope for enforcement. Many mothers remained powerless, trapped by the law, and subject to the whims of fathers with absolute authority. The legal system continued to treat maternal rights as conditional privileges rather than inherent protections. The cruelty of denying mothers legal control extended beyond custody. It affected inheritance, property management, and guardianship. Fathers could allocate children as inheritances, determine educational paths, and make medical decisions without maternal consultation. Mothers' knowledge, experience, and moral guidance were treated as optional. In some cases, even the children's welfare, as recognized by modern standards, was subordinated to paternal prerogative. Public outcry over such cases grew slowly but persistently. Pamphlets, novels, and newspaper essays began to portray the suffering of mothers as a social problem, challenging the assumption that legal paternal authority was always just. Reformers highlighted individual cases to illuminate systemic flaws, emphasizing that love, caregiving, and moral responsibility were insufficient in a legal framework that ignored women's personhood. These debates planted the seeds for further legislative change, though real power remained limited. Victorian society acknowledged the problem but resisted structural reform, framing it as a moral or religious dilemma rather than a matter of legal inequity. Mothers continued to bear the emotional, social, and practical burdens of their exclusion, while fathers retained near absolute control. The cumulative effect on families was profound. Emotional bonds were disrupted, children grew up with fragmented caregiving, and mothers endured trauma that could last decades. Legal erasure created consequences far beyond courtrooms. It shaped households, communities, and entire generations. Mothers who lost their children often remained socially marginalized, their authority questioned even in informal settings. Despite these obstacles, resistance continued. Mothers developed strategies to maintain influence over their children within the constraints imposed by law. Letters, secret visits, moral instruction, and religious guidance became avenues through which women sought to assert their agency. While limited, these efforts demonstrated that maternal influence could survive, even in the shadow of legal erasure. Yet, the law remained the ultimate arbiter until legislative and societal reforms expanded recognition of maternal rights. The mother's claim to her children was conditional, precarious, and continually subject to denial. The cruelty lay not merely in temporary separation, but in a system that institutionalized the mother's powerlessness, framing dependence as natural and inevitable. In the narrative of Victorian women's lives, this ruled the denial of maternal rights stands as one of the most profound and lasting injustices. It forced women to confront the possibility that their love, care, and moral guidance were legally invisible, teaching lessons of endurance, sorrow, and, eventually, determination. These experiences seeded the advocacy that would reshape family law over decades to come. For now, however, mothers lived in a world where giving life did not guarantee guardianship, where nurturing did not grant authority, and where the law recognized only fathers. The cruelest rule of all was that it could all be done legally, without challenge, and without recognition of the mother's pain. And so, the story of maternal erasure continues her struggle, her resilience, and the seeds of reform that would one day demand that motherhood be legally recognized as a right, not merely a duty. A glimpse of resistance. The story of Caroline Norton, in the midst of the rigid, unyielding legal structures of Victorian England, where women could lose their property, wages, and even children to their husbands. One woman emerged as a voice that could not be silenced: Caroline Norton. Her story is not merely a tale of personal struggle. It is a window into the first sparks of organized resistance against the legal erasure of women in a society that denied mothers' authority, wives' autonomy, and daughters' recognition. Norton dared to challenge the system, exposing its cruelty to the public and forcing lawmakers to confront realities they had long ignored. Caroline's early life was marked by intellect, culture, and independence. Born into a family that valued education and social engagement. She developed a keen awareness of both societal expectation and personal rights. She was not naive about the constraints placed upon women, but she also possessed the confidence and eloquence to articulate grievances that many could only feel in private. Her writing poetry, essays, and political commentary already positioned her as a voice in public discourse, giving her tools she would later wield in defense of her own liberty and that of other women. Marriage, however, quickly revealed the harsh limits of female autonomy. Caroline married George Norton, a man whose temper was volatile and whose sense of entitlement mirrored the legal authority granted to husbands under Victorian law. Within months, she found herself trapped in a cycle of domestic humiliation, emotional abuse, and economic dependence. The law, rather than providing recourse, sided by default with her husband. Caroline's identity, property, and even her relationship with her children were threatened, all under the guise of marital unity and paternal authority. The turning point came when Caroline's husband sought to use the law to remove her children from her care. As a mother, she had nurtured and loved them, yet the legal system declared them legally his. She could not sue. She could not be heard in court, and the threat of permanent separation loomed. For many women, this would have been a point of resignation, a cruel but unavoidable truth. For Caroline, it became a call to action. Harnessing the tools available to her, Caroline turned to the power of the press and public opinion. She began writing pamphlets, letters, and essays that exposed the legal and social injustices faced by married women. Her words painted a vivid picture of suffering imposed by law and custom. Wives without rights, mothers without custody, women whose voices were silenced by the very institutions that claimed to protect them. She argued passionately that love and labor were insufficient without legal recognition, and that justice demanded structural reform. One of the most compelling aspects of Caroline's approach was her use of personal experience as evidence. She did not couch her arguments solely in abstract legal theory. She presented her life as testimony, in detailing her struggles with marital abuse, financial deprivation, and threats to her children. She highlighted the concrete consequences of systemic injustice. Her story illustrated how laws that appeared neutral in principle wreaked profound harm in practice, demonstrating that legal reform was not merely a moral choice, but a societal necessity. Caroline's activism was not without risk. In Victorian society, women who spoke publicly on matters of law and justice were often branded as impertinent, immoral, or socially dangerous. Her challenges to male authority invited scorn, gossip, and sometimes open hostility. Yet she persisted, leveraging her literary skills, social connections, and moral credibility to gain attention and rally support. Her courage lay not only in exposing her own plight, but in articulating a collective grievance that many women could recognize, but could not voice. The impact of Caroline Norton's advocacy began to ripple through society. By drawing attention to the legal erasure of mothers, she prompted public discussion of issues previously considered private or taboo. Her case became a reference point for reformers, journalists, and politicians, illustrating how one woman's fight could illuminate the structural injustices affecting countless others. Through her efforts, the human cost of laws that denied women autonomy, property rights, and custody became undeniable in Parliament. Her struggle influenced debates around the Custody of Infants Act of 1839. While limited in scope, the act represented the first acknowledgement that mothers could have legal claims to their children under certain circumstances, particularly in cases of paternal neglect or abuse. Caroline's advocacy was instrumental in shaping public perception and legislative willingness, demonstrating that persistent, reasoned, and morally compelling argument could challenge entrenched legal authority. Beyond legal reform, Caroline's story inspired cultural and social reflection. Writers, artists, and intellectuals began to explore the plight of women trapped by law and custom, creating a discourse that went beyond individual legislation to question societal assumptions about gender, power, and authority. The figure of the wronged but eloquent woman became a symbol of resistance, a template for advocacy that blended personal narrative with political strategy. Caroline's resistance also highlighted the intersection of multiple forms of oppression. Her financial dependence, legal invisibility, and threats to maternal authority were not isolated issues. They were interconnected. Each legal constraint reinforced the others, creating a complex web that trapped women socially, economically, and emotionally. By confronting this network as a whole, rather than addressing one grievance in isolation, Caroline demonstrated the need for comprehensive reform. Her strategy emphasized both legality and morality. She appealed to lawmakers' sense of justice, while also appealing to the public's empathy. She exposed the dissonance between societal ideals of virtue, motherhood, and morality, and the legal realities that undermined them. In doing so, she forced society to reconcile its self-image with the lived experiences of women, revealing the hypocrisies embedded in Victorian social and legal structures. Despite progress, Caroline's victory was partial. The Custody of Infants Act offered limited relief and applied primarily to middle and upper-class women who could navigate the legal system and access representation. Women of lesser means continued to face extreme vulnerability, unable to contest the removal of their children or the control of their husbands. The act signaled potential, not universal change, highlighting the ongoing struggle that would occupy generations of women reformers. Caroline's life also underscored the personal costs of public resistance. She endured social criticism, emotional strain, and the complexities of managing her own family under constant scrutiny. Her children, too, were caught in the intersection of maternal advocacy and legal limitation, illustrating the long-term implications of structural injustice. Her personal sacrifice amplified her public impact, providing a stark example of the courage required to confront entrenched systems. The significance of Caroline Norton extends beyond her immediate victories. She exemplifies the potential for individual agency to challenge collective oppression, demonstrating that even within a system designed to erase women's voices, resistance was possible. Her story provides both a historical record of injustice and a model for activism, one that combines personal experience, public engagement, and moral argument to force structural change. Her struggle also illuminates the broader context of women's rights in Victorian England. Caroline's fight was not solely about custody. It was about the interconnected web of legal, economic, and social constraints that limited female autonomy. By targeting the custody issue, she addressed the symbolic and practical nexus of power, creating a precedent for broader campaigns in property rights, financial independence, and legal recognition. Through Caroline's example, later generations of women reformers gained inspiration and legitimacy. Her narrative became a touchstone in debates over the Married Women's Property Acts and subsequent legislation that gradually expanded women's rights to property, earnings, and guardianship. The chain of advocacy she helped forge extended far beyond her lifetime, influencing both law and social consciousness in Britain and, indirectly, in other English-speaking nations. Yet, Caroline's story also illustrates the limitations of relying on individual heroism. While her courage produced meaningful change, it required immense personal sacrifice and was contingent on social visibility, literary skill, and connections. Many women suffered in silence, unable to leverage such resources. Her story highlights both the power and the precariousness of resistance in a society structured to deny women legal and social agency. At this juncture, Caroline's actions mark a crucial turning point in the narrative of Victorian women's lives. She demonstrated that legal erasure, financial dependence, and maternal disempowerment could be contested through eloquence, strategic engagement, and moral clarity. Her struggle exposed the structural injustices of coverture and maternal disenfranchisement, providing a blueprint for advocacy that would influence decades of legal reform. And so, Caroline Norton's resistance becomes a pivotal chapter, a glimpse of what courage, intellect, and moral clarity can achieve even when the law and society conspire to silence women. The struggle she ignited would continue, shaping the battles for property, autonomy, and maternal rights that lay ahead in the unfolding story of Victorian women's lives. Fighting for the sons, a mother's battle against the establishment. In Victorian England, the bond between a mother and her children was often tested not by affection but by law. For many women, particularly those of Caroline Norton's generation, motherhood was a site of constant struggle. It was a struggle against societal norms, against abusive or indifferent husbands, and, most sharply, against an establishment that denied women legal recognition of their most intimate and sacred relationships. Norton's fight to retain access to her sons exemplifies the lengths a mother had to go to challenge a system designed to marginalize her. Caroline's eldest son, George, became the focal point of her legal and personal struggle. After her estrangement from her husband, George Norton, Caroline was confronted with a stark reality. Though she had nurtured, educated, and loved her son from birth, the law afforded her no authority over his custody under the prevailing statutes. Her husband alone was the legal guardian, able to decide George's residence, education, and even daily routine. For Caroline, the cruelest irony lay in her complete devotion. She had raised him with care, yet the law treated her presence as optional. The battle for her sons began quietly. Caroline attempted to negotiate with her husband, appealing to his sense of morality and social reputation. She offered compromises, supervised visitation, structured arrangements for schooling, and assurances of propriety. Her appeals were met with indifference and sometimes hostility. George Norton wielded his legal rights as a weapon, exploiting the law's rigid deference to paternal authority. Every attempt at compromise only underscored the systemic imbalance. The mother's desires, no matter how reasonable, were legally irrelevant. When private negotiation failed, Caroline turned to the press and public opinion, a tactic both daring and dangerous in Victorian society. She authored letters, essays, and pamphlets detailing her plight, exposing the structural injustice that allowed fathers to wield absolute power over children. Her writing did not merely recount personal suffering. It framed her case as emblematic of the plight of countless mothers whose voices were silenced by law. In doing so, she transformed a personal grievance into a political argument, challenging assumptions about family, authority, and justice. This approach, however, carried significant risks. Victorian society expected women to be modest, obedient, and private, particularly in matters of family. By publicly confronting her husband and the legal establishment, Caroline exposed herself to social censure. Critics labeled her impertinent, immodest, or even morally suspect. Yet she persisted, understanding that visibility was essential. Change could not occur in secrecy. Her courage forced the public, legislators, and the judiciary to confront the consequences of their own legal framework. Caroline's legal strategy was equally meticulous. She petitioned Parliament and engaged sympathetic politicians who understood both the injustice and the potential for public outrage. Her case highlighted specific abuses. A mother separated from her children, denied visitation, and unable to influence their upbringing. She argued that such exclusion was not only unfair but socially harmful, depriving children of maternal guidance and creating emotional harm that the law refused to acknowledge. The establishment initially resisted. Judges and lawmakers were steeped in centuries of tradition, reinforced by the doctrine of coverture, which defined married women's legal existence as subsumed under their husbands. Custody was treated as property control, not as a moral or emotional responsibility. The very idea that a mother could possess legitimate claims independent of her husband challenged deeply ingrained assumptions about gender, authority, and family structure. Yet Caroline's persistence gradually shifted the discourse by providing concrete examples of neglect, emotional deprivation, and the psychological consequences of paternal-only custody. She forced legal authorities to acknowledge the human costs of their rigid doctrines. Her advocacy illuminated a contradiction. While society praised motherhood as central to morality and virtue, it denied mothers the power to fulfill those roles in law. This dissonance became increasingly difficult for the establishment to ignore. Caroline's struggle also drew attention to the intersection of class and legal power. Middle and upper-class women, like her, could leverage social connections, access to publication, and political networks to contest custody. Working-class mothers, however, remained almost entirely powerless, unable to navigate the legal system or attract public attention. Caroline's case, therefore, served both as inspiration and as a stark reminder of systemic inequity. The law's recognition of maternal rights would be contingent on social status, at least initially in her personal life. The battle for her sons took a heavy toll. Caroline endured relentless anxiety, emotional strain, and the constant threat of losing daily contact with her children. Every court hearing, parliamentary session, or public statement carried potential risk to her reputation, her mental health, and her very sense of agency. Yet these pressures never deterred her. Her maternal devotion was inseparable from her activism. Love for her children became the engine of her fight for legal reform. One of the critical breakthroughs came when public sentiment began to favor her cause. Newspapers chronicled her struggle, framing it as both a personal tragedy and a broader injustice. Letters poured in from women who recognized their own suffering in Caroline's experience. Public opinion, once indifferent or hostile, began to apply pressure on legislators and judges. Her struggle demonstrated the power of combining personal testimony with advocacy, using both legal reasoning and moral persuasion to confront entrenched authority. The eventual legislative response, though limited, represented a significant milestone. The Custody of Infants Act of 1839 allowed courts to consider maternal claims in certain circumstances, particularly in cases of paternal neglect or abuse. While far from comprehensive, the act acknowledged, for the first time, that mothers possessed rights distinct from their husbands. Caroline's efforts had transformed abstract legal principles into tangible relief. opening a pathway for future reforms that would gradually expand women's legal agency. Beyond legislative outcomes, Caroline's story reshaped cultural expectations. Her public confrontation of legal authority challenged the notion that women must accept subordination in silence. By asserting her maternal rights and exposing systemic injustice, she demonstrated that women could wield moral, intellectual, and strategic power to influence both law and society. Her case became a reference point for subsequent reformers, illustrating that personal struggle could structural change. Caroline's advocacy also highlighted the limitations of the law in protecting children. Even with legal recognition, enforcement remained inconsistent. Fathers retained significant discretion, and courts continued to balance paternal authority heavily in their favor. Nonetheless, her persistence established a precedent. Maternal claims were no longer entirely invisible, and the concept of children's welfare as a factor in custody decisions gained traction. Her fight was deeply personal as well as political. Caroline's correspondence and diaries reveal a mother's anguish over every separation, every denied visit, every moment her sons grew up without her presence. These intimate details humanize the abstract legal debate, reminding society that laws govern real lives, emotions, and relationships. In her words, the struggle for her sons was inseparable from the struggle for justice, dignity, and recognition. The case of Caroline Norton also underscores the interplay between law, society, and gender norms. Victorian society valued maternal devotion in rhetoric, but denied it in practice. Mothers were expected to nurture, sacrifice, and guide, yet lacked the legal authority to protect or influence their children when circumstances required. Caroline's activism revealed this contradiction and forced the establishment to confront its moral and practical implications. Ultimately, Caroline's struggle for her sons exemplifies the broader fight for women's rights in the 19th century. Custody was just one battlefield in a larger war over property, wages, legal identity, and social recognition. By challenging paternal authority, advocating publicly, and leveraging moral and legal arguments, Caroline demonstrated that entrenched systems could be contested, even in the face of overwhelming institutional inertia. Her story resonates across generations because it illustrates the cost of legal invisibility and the power of determined advocacy. Mothers like Caroline faced systemic obstacles designed to erase them from their children's lives, yet they persevered, blending personal courage with strategic action. Their victories, partial though they may have been, laid the groundwork for subsequent reforms in custody, property rights, and women's legal identity. For Caroline Norton, the battle for her sons was never simply about personal vindication. It was about exposing injustice, challenging societal norms, and forcing recognition of women as autonomous actors with moral and legal claims. Her struggle illuminated the human consequences of coverture, maternal disenfranchisement, and legal paternalism, and it set the stage for broader reforms that would slowly, unevenly, but inexorably transform women's lives in Britain and beyond. I exist and I suffer. The radical call for recognition. In Victorian England, the legal and social systems often rendered women invisible. Wives had no independent legal identity. Mothers could be denied custody of their children. Working women's earnings could be claimed by their husbands, and women in general were expected to endure suffering silently. Amid these structural injustices, a growing chorus of voices began to demand recognition not just for specific grievances, but for the fundamental existence and humanity of women. Among these voices was Caroline Norton, whose public activism had already shaken the foundations of legal paternalism. Yet, beyond her, countless women felt the radical need to declare, "I exist and I suffer." The phrase "I exist and I suffer" captures both a personal and collective cry. It reflects a woman's awareness of her own personhood in a society that denied it, coupled with the deep pain of having her experiences invalidated. Women in Victorian England were often denied the ability to assert themselves legally, financially, and socially, yet they were expected to perform the roles society demanded of them. The cognitive dissonance between societal expectation and personal reality created a powerful urgency to demand recognition. Take, for example, the married woman trapped under the doctrine of coverture. Legally, she did not exist as a separate entity from her husband. Yet in daily life, she experienced all the consequences of her own labor, decisions, and emotional investments. When she tried to assert her interests, whether to protect property, earn wages, or defend her children, the law refused to acknowledge her claim. She was compelled to witness injustice perpetrated in her own household without recourse, forced to endure suffering that the legal system would not recognize. This systemic erasure fostered a radical consciousness among women. They began to articulate not just specific grievances, but the fundamental injustice of invisibility. Writers, activists, and ordinary women alike began to publish essays, letters, and pamphlets that challenged the assumptions underpinning law and society. They declared that women were not mere appendages of their husbands, that their labor and intellect had value, and that suffering should not be normalized or ignored. This was not a demand for charity or pity, it was a demand for recognition of rights, identity, and dignity. In her public writings, Caroline Norton exemplified this call by documenting her own experiences, her loss of property, her struggle to see her children, her husband's attempts to control her finances. She highlighted the gap between societal ideals of womanhood and the harsh legal realities. Her work resonated with women across class lines who experienced similar forms of invisibility. Through her voice, private suffering became a public claim, challenging the legitimacy of a legal system that had long ignored the lived experiences of women. The radical nature of this call lay in its assertion of presence. "I exist" was a defiance of erasure. It rejected the notion that a woman's identity should be subsumed under her husband, that her labor and emotional labor were unworthy of acknowledgement, or that her suffering was incidental. It demanded that law, society, and culture recognize her as a full human being, capable of rights, responsibilities, and moral agency. "I suffer" complemented this assertion of existence. By acknowledging pain, women demanded accountability. They refused the comforting fiction that endurance was virtue, insisting instead that injustice be named, measured, and rectified. Suffering was transformed from private experience into political evidence, a lens through which legal and social reforms could be justified. This shift represented a radical reframing of morality and justice, moving from endurance to recognition. The medium through which women expressed this call was significant. Novels, essays, newspaper articles, letters, and petitions became vehicles for resistance. Writing provided women with a platform when courts and institutions denied them agency. Public discourse allowed private experience to shape policy debates, bridging the gap between personal suffering and collective awareness. In essence, literature and journalism became arenas of legal and social activism, amplifying voices that were otherwise silenced. Consider the case of mothers separated from their children. Under Victorian law, paternal authority often nullified maternal attachment. Women whose children were removed could not act in court, nor could they rely on moral persuasion alone. By publicizing their suffering, detailing emotional anguish, disrupted caregiving, and the social consequences of their exclusion, women transformed individual pain into evidence that the law and society could no longer ignore. Recognition of suffering became a tool for advocacy. Similarly, women who had worked outside the home experienced erasure of their economic contributions. Earnings that should have belonged to them were claimed by husbands, yet society did not acknowledge their labor as legitimate property. The phrase "I exist and I suffer" thus encompassed economic invisibility, as well as emotional and legal disenfranchisement. By asserting their presence and demanding accountability, women reframed labor and earnings as matters of rights, rather than charity or moral expectation. The radical call for recognition also intersected with moral and cultural norms. Victorian society expected women to embody virtue, modesty, and publicly asserting existence and suffering was therefore transgressive. Women who spoke out risked social censure, being labeled impertinent or unfit. Yet this very risk highlighted the radical courage of the movement. It challenged both law and culture, asserting that injustice could not be tolerated in silence. Caroline Norton's influence extended beyond her personal struggles to the broader women's rights movement. Her writings and activism helped to normalize the public articulation of suffering and the claim for recognition. By connecting personal grievance with structural critique, she laid the groundwork for future campaigns in property rights, custody, law, and legal identity. Her example demonstrated that personal voice could challenge institutions and affect systemic change. The radicalism of declaring "I exist and I suffer" lies not only in critique, but in envisioning alternatives. Women began to articulate visions of legal systems that recognized maternal authority, allowed married women to control property and wages, and respected individual identity separate from marital status. The call for recognition was thus simultaneously a critique of existing structures and a blueprint for reform. Public engagement became a key strategy. Women petitioned Parliament, corresponded with sympathetic legislators, and mobilized social networks to amplify their grievances. Publications documented individual cases, transforming private suffering into collective evidence. Through persistent advocacy, these voices forced consideration of reforms such as the Custody of Infants Act, the Married Women's Property Acts, and subsequent legislation aimed at expanding legal recognition of women. The process of asserting existence and suffering was iterative and cumulative. Individual stories resonated with wider audiences, creating a feedback loop. Testimony informed public opinion, which influenced legislative debate, which in turn validated the claims of other women. Each assertion of existence built momentum, demonstrating that systemic recognition could not be denied indefinitely. Yet the struggle was far from complete. Recognition did not automatically translate into equality. Women still faced limitations in property ownership, legal agency, and parental authority. The radical call for recognition was a first step, demanding acknowledgement of presence and pain. But the path to full legal and social equality would remain long and contested. By articulating existence and suffering, women began to assert moral authority alongside legal claims. They challenged assumptions that endurance was virtue, insisting that injustice be addressed. Public testimony, literature, and political engagement became tools for asserting presence in a system designed to erase them. The act of speaking, in itself, was revolutionary. It declared that women's lives mattered, that their suffering could not be dismissed, and that law and society had obligations to recognize and rectify injustice. The phrase, "I exist and I suffer," also bridged personal and collective experience. Individual grievances were elevated into systemic critique, linking private pain to structural inequality. Women's writings and public advocacy highlighted patterns of oppression, making it impossible for lawmakers and society to treat suffering as anecdotal or isolated. This collective recognition strengthened demands for legislative and cultural change. Furthermore, this radical call influenced subsequent legal reforms by demonstrating the human consequences of coverture, maternal disenfranchisement, and financial dependence. Women's advocacy created moral and practical imperatives for change. The recognition of suffering became a foundation for legal arguments in cases of custody, property, and financial independence. It illustrated that law must account for lived experience, not merely abstract principles. Caroline Norton and other pioneers of this movement exemplified the courage required to confront a system designed to render women invisible. By insisting on recognition, they transformed personal suffering into public and political leverage, challenging centuries of entrenched authority. Their actions laid the groundwork for future legal reforms that would gradually expand women's rights and agency. The first crack. Parliament passes the Custody of Infants Act, 1839. In the early decades of Victorian England, the legal system had long ignored the voices of women, particularly mothers, in matters of family, property, and child custody. For centuries, fathers held near absolute authority over their children, a reality codified under the doctrine of coverture. Married women had no independent legal existence, no claim to earnings, and, most devastatingly, no inherent rights to their children. This entrenched system treated women's labor, care, and emotional investment as invisible, and it perpetuated a cycle of dependency and suffering that few could challenge successfully. Yet, by 1839, the first visible cracks began to appear in this formidable edifice of paternal authority with the passage of the Custody of Infants Act. The act itself emerged from decades of advocacy, public debate, and the tireless work of reformers who highlighted the suffering of mothers. Caroline Norton, whose own battle to see her children captured national attention, played a pivotal role in galvanizing both public opinion and political support. By documenting her personal experiences of loss, her estrangement, and her struggle to maintain contact with her sons, Norton transformed a private grievance into a public cause. Her writings, letters to newspapers, and lobbying of sympathetic politicians illustrated the profound injustices inherent in the law and created momentum for legislative change. The Custody of Infants Act of 1839, though limited in scope, marked a critical departure from centuries of unchallenged paternal authority. For the first time, it granted mothers the ability to petition for custody of children under 7 years old and to seek access to older children under certain circumstances. While the law did not confer equal rights, nor did it dismantle the broader system of male control, it recognized that maternal care and attachment had legal significance. It was the first formal acknowledgement that children's welfare could be considered in the context of maternal custody. For mothers across England, the passage of the act was both a victory and a revelation. It demonstrated that persistent advocacy could challenge the law, yet it also underscored the limitations that remained. Only women with sufficient social status and access to legal resources could realistically benefit from the act. Poorer mothers, or those without influential connections, continued to face overwhelming obstacles in asserting custody. Nevertheless, the legislation represented a tangible crack in the legal structure that had long rendered women invisible. In the eyes of the state Caroline, Norton's role in the creation of this act cannot be overstated. Her public letters and personal appeals humanized the abstract legal debate. She described in vivid detail the anguish of mothers separated from their children, highlighting not only the personal pain but the broader social consequences of denying maternal influence. By framing the struggle as a moral and societal issue, rather than simply a private grievance, she compelled lawmakers to confront the human impact of their statutes. The political context of the 1830s also played a crucial role in facilitating this legislative shift. Britain was undergoing gradual social and political change. The rise of print media, the expansion of public debate, and a growing recognition of the need for legal reform in areas such as child welfare and family law created an environment in which maternal advocacy could gain traction. Reformers argued that the rigid enforcement of paternal authority was not only unjust, but also socially harmful, perpetuating cycles of neglect, abuse, and maternal suffering. The Custody of Infants Act, therefore, was both a product of individual advocacy and broader social currents. It represented an intersection of personal narrative and public policy. Mothers who had suffered silently for generations now had a legal foothold, however small, to assert their claims. The act formalized the idea that children's welfare and maternal bonds could no longer be dismissed solely in favor of paternal prerogative. For families affected by the law, the impact was immediate and profound. Women who had previously been powerless to contest paternal custody could now petition courts, drawing upon the authority of legislation to make their claims. Even when success was partial or limited, the very act of asserting maternal rights challenged the status quo and introduced the possibility of legal recognition for women's emotional and moral authority. Yet the act's limitations were stark. Custody rights were generally restricted to young children, often under the age of 7, reflecting contemporary beliefs about the proper age for maternal influence. Fathers retained substantial authority over older children, and the courts retained discretion in determining the application of the law. Economic and social disparities continued to shape outcomes, with wealthier women more likely to succeed in custody petitions than poorer counterparts. In essence, the legislation opened a door but left many barriers intact. Despite these constraints, the act represented a symbolic breakthrough. For the first time, the law acknowledged that women's existence and maternal suffering had legal relevance. The phrase "I exist and I suffer," articulated by activists like Norton, found a partial echo in statute. The recognition, however limited, validated the experiences of countless women who had endured invisibility, deprivation, and emotional turmoil within the domestic sphere. The passage of the Custody of Infants Act also catalyzed further activism. Reformers recognized that legal recognition of maternal custody was only one step in a broader struggle for women's rights. Issues such as property ownership, wages, and contractual independence remained unresolved, and many activists began to link custody advocacy with broader campaigns for legal and social reform. The act provided both precedent and momentum for these future battles, demonstrating that incremental legal changes could have transformative effects. For the mothers who could access its protections, the act offered more than legal recourse. It offered moral validation. The law now acknowledged that their bonds with their children mattered, that maternal care was socially and legally significant, and that their suffering could no longer be entirely ignored. Women who had endured loss, indignity, and helplessness now had a framework within which to assert agency and pursue justice. The Act's passage also influenced public perception. Newspapers and pamphlets covering the legislation highlighted the plight of mothers, portraying their struggles as emblematic of broader societal injustice. Stories of mothers successfully petitioning for custody humanized the legal reforms, shifting public understanding of family, authority, and justice. By bringing the experiences of individual women into public discourse, the Act helped to reshape social attitudes toward maternal authority. Legally, the Custody of Infants Act laid the groundwork for subsequent reforms. While it did not abolish coverture or establish full gender equality, it introduced the principle that maternal care could be a determining factor in custody decisions. This principle would underpin later legislation, including the Married Women's Property Acts and expanded custody rights in the latter half of the 19th century. Norton's advocacy, combined with public support, demonstrated that persistent pressure could transform legal norms. The personal impact on Caroline Norton was profound. Her sons, though still subject to paternal oversight, became accessible in ways previously unimaginable. Her activism validated her maternal devotion, proving that a mother's voice could shape the lives of her children and influence the legal system. Yet her struggle also highlighted the ongoing vulnerabilities of women, emphasizing that legal recognition alone could not eliminate societal and familial power imbalances. Socially, the Act's passage represented a tentative acknowledgement that women's experiences and voices mattered. While still constrained by class and legal status, the legislation introduced a framework through which women could assert agency in the domestic sphere. It challenged the entrenched notion that father's authority was absolute and signal, the beginning of a broader reevaluation of gendered power in family law. The first crack in the legal edifice of Victorian paternal authority of a Custody of Infants Act was thus both practical and symbolic. It offered tangible protections for some mothers, while simultaneously signaling to society that the claims, suffering, and existence of women could no longer be entirely ignored. It provided a precedent for future advocacy, demonstrating that even deeply entrenched legal doctrines could be contested and modified. For mothers who had endured decades of helplessness, the Act represented hope. It validated the moral and emotional labor they had performed without recognition, and it offered a path, however narrow, toward reclaiming agency in their children's lives. The legislation signaled that the state could intervene to protect maternal rights, introducing a new dimension to family law, where women's voices and experiences were relevant. Yet, even as the Custody of Infants Act marked a breakthrough, it also illuminated the distance still to be traveled. Fathers retained substantial authority, and the courts continued to favor paternal claims in many cases. The law's recognition of maternal custody was limited, selective, and often contingent upon social status. The struggle for full equality, encompassing property rights, financial independence, and broader legal recognition, remained an ongoing battle. Nonetheless, the passage of the Act created momentum. It provided reformers with legal precedent, political legitimacy, and public visibility. By codifying the principle that maternal care mattered, it challenged centuries of unquestioned paternal authority and laid the foundation for subsequent legislation that would gradually expand women's rights and protections. Caroline Norton's role in this transformation cannot be overstated. Through her advocacy, public writing, and personal example, she demonstrated that individual courage could intersect with structural reform. Her struggle for custody highlighted the human cost of legal invisibility and provided a tangible demonstration that persistent, strategic advocacy could effect meaningful change. The Custody of Infants Act of 1839 was, therefore, both a legal and cultural milestone. It marked the beginning of the formal recognition of maternal rights, initiated public discourse on the moral and legal responsibilities of fathers, and provided a blueprint for further reforms. For Victorian women, it offered a glimpse of justice, however partial, and a foundation upon which future generations could build. This first crack in the system of paternal absolutism would widen over the decades, leading to more comprehensive reforms that challenged coverture, recognized women's property rights, and affirmed their legal identity. The journey had begun, and the struggle for recognition, justice, and equality continued. A limited victory, why the 1839 Act was not true equality. The passage of the Custody of Infants Act in 1839 was celebrated by many as a landmark moment in the struggle for women's rights. For mothers across England, it offered a glimmer of hope, a legal acknowledgement that their bonds with their children had value. Yet, beneath the veneer of victory lay profound limitations. The Act, while groundbreaking in its recognition of maternal claims, was far from a triumph of equality. It revealed the persistence of systemic inequities and the narrow scope of legal reform in Victorian society. At its core, the Act allowed mothers to petition for custody of children under the age of 7 and for access to older children under certain conditions. This was, on paper, a significant change. For the first time, courts could consider maternal care in custody decisions. Yet this limitation underscored the persistent assumption that maternal influence was only appropriate for very young children. Fathers retained almost unchallenged authority over older children, reflecting societal beliefs about the proper exercise of paternal power and the gendered division of parental responsibility. The Act's reach was also heavily conditioned by class and resources. Middle and upper-class women, who had access to legal counsel and social influence, were most likely to benefit from the legislation. Working-class mothers, lacking money, social standing, or access to sympathetic legal networks, remained largely powerless. For them, the law did little more than formalize a hope that might never be realized. Legal reform was not universal. It was selective, reinforcing social hierarchies even as it attempted to address injustice. Moreover, the Act did not grant mothers inherent rights to property or financial independence. Custody was legally meaningful only insofar as the mother could support the children and navigate the courts. Without control over her own earnings, inheritance, or household resources, many mothers found that their ability to exercise custody was practically limited. The law recognized their existence and suffering but did not provide the tools to act fully on that recognition. In this sense, the Act created a partial solution to a systemic problem without dismantling the structures that had caused it. Enforcement of the Act also revealed its limitations. Courts retained considerable discretion in interpreting the law. Judges often favored fathers, unless a mother could demonstrate exceptional circumstances, such as paternal abuse or neglect. This meant that, in practice, maternal custody remained difficult to obtain. The legislation acknowledged women's rights in theory, but left the implementation largely in the hands of a judiciary steeped in traditional gender norms, who were often reluctant to challenge paternal authority. the social climate further complicated the Act's impact. Victorian society continued to prioritize patriarchal authority and domestic hierarchy. Mothers asserting legal claims were often labeled impertinent, morally suspect, or socially inappropriate. Even when courts ruled in favor of maternal custody, social stigma and community opinion could undermine the mother's ability to exercise her rights freely. Legal recognition did not automatically translate into social acceptance, leaving women vulnerable to informal forms of oppression and isolation. Additionally, the Act failed to address broader issues of gender inequality embedded in law and society. Women remained subject to coverture, meaning their legal identities were largely subsumed by their husbands. They could not control property, wages, or contracts independently. The recognition of maternal rights in custody disputes, while significant, did not challenge the fundamental legal structures that rendered women dependent and legally invisible. It was a narrow victory within a broader system of systemic disadvantage. Despite these limitations, the 1839 Act held symbolic significance. It was the first formal acknowledgement that mothers were not merely appendages to their husbands and that their relationships with their children had legal relevance. It offered a precedent for subsequent reforms and demonstrated that persistent advocacy could produce tangible legal change. Activists like Carolyn Norton used this victory as a foundation to push for further reforms in property law, custody, and women's legal recognition. Yet the partial nature of the victory also fueled further activism. Reformers recognized that while maternal custody had been acknowledged, true equality required a broader restructuring of women's legal rights. Advocacy expanded beyond custody to include property rights, financial independence, and contractual agency. The fight for equality became a multifaceted struggle, addressing interconnected forms of legal and social marginalization. For the women affected, the Act was both empowering and frustrating. It validated their existence and suffering, granting a measure of legal recourse previously unavailable. Yet it also reinforced the reality that women's rights were conditional, limited, and subject to interpretation by male authorities. Mothers could fight and win custody for their youngest children, but older children, property, and financial autonomy remained largely out of reach. The law had recognized a problem, but had only begun to address it. In families, the impact of the Act was uneven. Some mothers were able to regain custody or access, experiencing a partial restoration of maternal authority. Others, particularly those with fewer resources or less social influence, saw little change in their circumstances. The legislation highlighted both the potential for reform and the persistent obstacles that would continue to challenge women's autonomy for decades. The limited scope of the 1839 Act also reflected broader societal attitudes toward gender, while Victorian England publicly idealized motherhood. It simultaneously constrained women's power to act as moral, economic, and legal agents. The law's acknowledgement of maternal claims was revolutionary in principle, but conservative in practice, reinforcing the broader structures of male dominance and female dependency. It demonstrated that legislative reform could create openings without fully dismantling entrenched hierarchies. Despite these constraints, the Act represented a foundation upon which future victories could be built. Activists used the legal precedent to argue for broader property rights, expanded custody provisions, and the eventual Married Women's Property Acts. The recognition that maternal care had legal significance challenged the idea that women's experiences were irrelevant and offered a model for incremental, strategic legal reform. Ultimately, the 1839 Custody of Infants Act was both a breakthrough and a reminder of the distance yet to travel. It cracked the facade of absolute paternal authority, providing mothers with a legal foothold, yet it left structural inequities largely intact. Women gained partial recognition of their rights, but not true equality, illustrating the incremental nature of legal and social reform in Victorian England. The Act marked a crucial step in the long struggle for women's legal and social recognition. It offered a glimpse of possibility while highlighting the limitations of partial reform, setting the stage for further battles over custody, property rights, and the legal identity of women. A decades-long struggle, the persistent fight for property rights in Victorian England. The struggle for women's property rights was both a legal and a deeply social battle, extending across decades and generations. The era was defined by the doctrine of coverture, a legal principle that subsumed a married woman's identity under her husband's. Under this doctrine, women could not own property independently, sign contracts, or control their earnings. Any inheritance, savings, or assets a woman brought into marriage instantly became the property of her husband, leaving her financially dependent and legally invisible. For many women, this legal reality shaped every aspect of life, from domestic power dynamics to societal status. The roots of the struggle lay deep within the legal traditions of England. Coverture had been established centuries earlier, enshrining the notion that upon marriage, a woman ceased to exist in law as a separate individual. Her property, labor, and even her legal rights were absorbed into her husband's identity. While men were free to accumulate wealth, sign contracts, and pursue independent legal claims, women's economic activity was bound to paternal or spousal oversight. The system assumed that male authority was both natural and just, and that women's primary sphere of influence was domestic, moral, and reproductive. For reformers, the challenge was monumental. They were fighting against centuries of entrenched legal precedent, social expectation, and cultural belief. Many argued that women were naturally dependent and incapable of managing property, a view reinforced in legal texts, parliamentary debates, and societal discourse. Overcoming these prejudices required not only legal acumen, but also social activism, public awareness, and moral persuasion. The fight was not simply for economic security. It was for recognition of women as full legal and moral agents. Caroline Norton, already well known for her work on maternal custody, emerged as a pivotal figure in highlighting the financial vulnerabilities of married women. Her personal experiences, particularly the loss of access to her own earnings and property upon marriage, illuminated the injustice of the system. By writing essays, letters, and pamphlets, she drew public attention to the economic erasure of women. Her story resonated widely. Many women recognized in her, experienced the structural constraints that shaped their own lives. The public's response to Caroline's advocacy demonstrated the potential of social pressure to influence legal reform. Newspapers serialized her accounts, debating the moral and legal implications of women's economic dependence. Letters from readers poured in, ranging from sympathetic mothers to intellectuals advocating systemic change. This growing awareness created the social context necessary for legislative action, showing that the problem was not isolated but widespread. Early attempts at reform met with resistance. Parliament and legal authorities were slow to act, and when they did, the measures were often limited in scope. Laws aimed at protecting women's property were incremental and partial, typically applying to specific cases, classes, or forms of property. The Married Women's Property Act of 1870, for for instance, allowed some earnings and inheritance to remain under a woman's control, but only under strict conditions. Wealth, status, and social connections continued to mediate access to legal rights, leaving many women still vulnerable. The decades-long struggle was characterized by a persistent strategy, incremental legal victories built upon public advocacy. Reformers understood that sweeping legal reform was unlikely in a society deeply invested in patriarchal structures. Instead, they aimed for targeted legislation, public awareness, and the gradual erosion of legal doctrines that denied women autonomy. Each victory, however modest, was a foothold for future progress. This struggle also involved mobilizing moral arguments alongside legal reasoning. Advocates emphasized that women were responsible for managing households, raising children, and contributing economically in ways that were often undervalued or unacknowledged. They argued that denying women control over property was not only unjust, but socially inefficient, preventing families from functioning effectively and harming children's welfare. By framing property rights as both moral and practical, reformers appealed to lawmakers' sense of duty and public sentiment. The Married Women's Property Acts, passed between 1870 and 1882, represented milestones in this long campaign. These laws gradually allowed women to retain earnings from their labor, control property inherited from parents, and enter into contracts independently of their husbands. While still imperfect, the acts codified the principle that women were legal persons with economic agency. The long-term significance of these reforms cannot be overstated. They provided both legal recognition and practical tools for women to assert independence, challenging centuries of male dominance. For women navigating daily life, these reforms offered tangible benefits. Earnings from employment could be retained, property inherited could remain under their control, and legal contracts became possible. This translated into greater autonomy in household management, financial planning, and personal decision. It also reshaped marital dynamics. Husbands could no longer claim absolute control over their wives' earnings or inheritance. The legal landscape began to reflect the idea that women were not mere appendages to their husbands, but autonomous actors with economic rights. Yet even with these advances, challenges persisted. Implementation was uneven. Courts interpreted statutes inconsistently, and societal attitudes often lagged behind legal reform. Many women lacked awareness of their newly established rights, or faced intimidation and obstruction in asserting them. For some, the formal recognition of property rights did not translate into practical empowerment, revealing the ongoing gap between law and lived experience. Activism during this period also emphasized the interconnection of property rights with other legal and social reforms. Custody, wages, contracts, and legal identity were all intertwined. Progress in one area often depended on advances in another. Advocates recognized that granting women control over property alone would be insufficient if they remained invisible under the law, unable to claim custody or earnings, or socially constrained from participating fully in public life. The decades-long struggle was thus holistic, addressing multiple dimensions of inequality simultaneously. Caroline Norton's advocacy exemplified this integrated approach. She did not focus solely on property or custody. Her efforts highlighted the cumulative impact of legal erasure by connecting personal narrative, public debate, and legislative lobbying. She illustrated that economic, familial, and legal injustices were interconnected. Her work provided a model for strategic activism, demonstrating how sustained effort, public visibility, and moral argument could create pressure for structural reform. The broader implications of this struggle extended beyond England. The discourse around women's property rights resonated in other English-speaking countries, influencing legal reforms in colonies and the United States. The principles established through Victorian advocacy legal recognition of married women's property, rights to earnings, and contractual autonomy formed the foundation for subsequent international campaigns for women's rights. Victorian reformers, by demonstrating the feasibility and necessity of legal recognition, contributed to a global movement for gender equality. In the domestic sphere, these reforms transformed women's lives in subtle but profound ways. Legal recognition of property rights empowered women to manage households, negotiate family finances, and make independent decisions. It also fostered psychological empowerment. Women could assert their presence and agency, no longer entirely subject to the whims of husbands or male relatives. Economic independence became both a practical tool and a symbol of autonomy, reshaping social expectations and family dynamics. The struggle for property rights also intersected with education and employment, as women gained legal recognition of earnings and property. Their participation in paid labor became more viable and socially accepted. This, in turn, provided additional leverage for autonomy and influence. Economic independence reinforced legal rights, creating a feedback loop that strengthened women's social and political agency over time. Despite progress, the struggle remained incomplete. Legal reforms were gradual, incremental, and contested. Women continued to face societal pressure, legal obstacles, and resistance from entrenched patriarchal norms. The victories of the 1870s and 1880s marked significant milestones, but did not establish full equality. Activists recognized that the fight for property rights was ongoing, a decades-long campaign requiring sustained effort, advocacy, and public engagement. Ultimately, the decades-long struggle for property rights illustrates both the resilience of Victorian women and the complexity of legal reform. Women like Caroline Norton laid the groundwork through personal courage, public advocacy, and strategic engagement. Each incremental victory, whether in custody, property, or wages, built upon previous efforts, demonstrating that systemic change, while slow, was possible. The persistence of these women transformed the legal landscape, creating pathways for autonomy, recognition, and justice. This struggle also highlights the interconnectedness of legal and social reform. Property rights were not simply economic. They were essential to autonomy, identity, and moral agency. The legislative roadblock, the arguments used to deny women rights in Victorian England. The fight for women's rights encountered not only entrenched social norms but also deliberate legislative roadblocks designed to maintain male dominance. Even as public opinion began to shift, and reformers like Caroline Norton exposed the injustices of coverture, financial dependence, and maternal disenfranchisement, lawmakers employed a variety of arguments to slow or block legal recognition of women's autonomy. These obstacles were both ideological and practical, reflecting centuries of entrenched patriarchal thinking that had been woven into the very fabric of law, governance, and society. One of the most pervasive arguments was the claim that women were naturally dependent and morally subordinate to men. Legislators and legal theorists asserted that women were inherently less rational, less capable of managing property, and unsuited to independent decisions. This reasoning drew on centuries of philosophical, religious, and cultural precedents that depicted women as morally virtuous but intellectually and legally inferior. By framing women's rights as dangerous or unnatural, lawmakers justified delaying reforms that could threaten male authority both at home and in society at large. This argument extended to the economic sphere. Critics of women's property rights contended that allowing women to control their own earnings, inheritances, or assets would disrupt family stability. The prevailing belief was that men were naturally responsible for managing resources, providing for the household, and ensuring social order. Women, it was claimed, would misuse or mismanage property, destabilizing families and society. Lawmakers often invoked the image of women squandering wealth, neglecting familial obligations, or undermining paternal authority to rationalize restrictions on property ownership and earnings. In the legal domain, opponents argued that granting women independent rights would create confusion and complexity in courts. Under coverture, a husband and wife were legally one person, the husband. Critics claimed that recognizing women as separate legal entities would complicate contracts, property ownership, and inheritance law. Judges, lawyers, and legislators raised concerns about overlapping claims, potential disputes, and the administrative burden of redefining legal identity. These procedural objections masked an ideological resistance to women's equality under law, framing the denial of rights as a matter of efficiency rather than justice. Another common roadblock was moralistic rhetoric surrounding marriage and domestic order. Critics claimed that women's independence would threaten the sanctity of marriage by encouraging rebellion, discord, or infidelity. Victorian society idealized women as obedient, nurturing, and and any attempt to grant legal or economic autonomy was portrayed as a threat to domestic harmony. Reformers were accused of encouraging moral laxity, destabilizing families, and promoting social disorder, a potent deterrent in a society that prized propriety and hierarchy. Custody and maternal rights were also obstructed by similar reasoning. Lawmakers contended that children were best placed under paternal authority, invoking arguments that fathers were naturally rational and morally sound guides. Mothers, even those demonstrating extraordinary competence and devotion, were depicted as overly emotional, partial, or incapable of making decisions in the best interest of the child. Courts often cited these assumptions to justify denying custody or limiting maternal access, reinforcing a legal system that prioritized patriarchal authority over maternal bonds. Religious doctrine frequently reinforced legislative resistance. Many legislators cited biblical and theological texts to argue that male authority was divinely sanctioned. Passages emphasizing the obedience of wives to husbands or the father's role as head of household were interpreted as legal principles, not merely moral guidance. This fusion of law, religion, and culture created a powerful ideological barrier. Challenging patriarchal legal structures was framed as not only socially disruptive, but morally suspect, even sinful. The rhetoric of protection was another barrier. Opponents of reform often claimed that women needed to be shielded from the responsibilities and risks of legal and economic independence. They argued that granting property rights or contractual autonomy would expose women to exploitation, financial ruin, or moral danger. In essence, the argument framed women as inherently weak and incapable of self-governance, justifying paternal or male oversight as necessary for their own well-being. This protective narrative masked systemic oppression under the guise of benevolence. Political considerations also played a role. Legislators feared that reforming women's legal rights might disrupt existing power structures, challenge male privilege, or create political instability. Granting women economic autonomy, custody rights, or contractual agency could shift family dynamics, redistribute wealth, and challenge the social hierarchy. Lawmakers who benefited from or were invested in maintaining patriarchal norms often lobbied against reform, citing tradition, precedent, and societal stability as reasons to resist change. Public opinion, while increasingly sympathetic to women's grievances, was not uniformly supportive. Critics in newspapers, pamphlets, and political debates framed reformers as radical, immodest, or socially dangerous. This climate of skepticism and opposition created additional barriers to legislative change, reinforcing the arguments used to delay or dilute reforms. Women who spoke out risked not only legal obstruction, but social ostracism, further complicating advocacy efforts. Economic arguments were also used to block women's rights. Critics contended that granting women control over property or wages would disrupt inheritance structures, family economies, and commercial practices. Men's legal authority over property was deeply tied to wealth accumulation and social power. Shifting these rights to women was framed as threatening both familial and societal stability. Economic rationales were thus deployed to mask ideological resistance, presenting the denial of women's rights as practical necessity rather than systemic oppression. Even when reform measures were proposed, legislative debates often sought to minimize their impact. Bills were narrowly tailored, limiting the scope of maternal custody, property control, or contractual authority. Legislators emphasized incremental change, arguing that women could be granted minor rights without challenging the broader legal and social order. While these measures represented progress, they were deliberately constrained to maintain the primacy of male authority. The limited victory approach reflected the tension between public pressure for reform and entrenched patriarchal resistance. The legal profession itself also functioned as a roadblock. Many lawyers and judges were invested in maintaining the status quo, both for ideological reasons and for professional advantage. They argued that women lacked the education, experience, or rational capacity to engage in legal contracts, manage property, or assert independent claims. Their opinions shaped court rulings, influenced legislative debates, and reinforced societal beliefs about female incapacity, even when statutes were passed. Judicial interpretation often minimized their effect, limiting the practical benefits to women. Resistance was not limited to formal arguments. It extended to social norms and cultural practices. Women were expected to be passive, modest, and compliant. Public advocacy, economic ambition, or legal assertiveness was framed as socially inappropriate. Reformers risked personal reputation, social ostracism, and moral condemnation by aligning legal authority with cultural expectations of female behavior. Lawmakers and society created a multi-layered barrier that extended beyond formal legislation into everyday life. Despite these obstacles, reformers persisted. They strategically countered arguments against women's rights by demonstrating practical competence, moral authority, and social responsibility. They documented cases of abuse, economic mismanagement by men, and the adverse effects of maternal exclusion. By framing reform not as a threat, but as a social improvement, advocates gradually undermined ideological resistance and expanded the legal and social imagination regarding women's capacities and rights. The long-term effect of these legislative roadblocks was twofold. First, they slowed progress, requiring decades of sustained advocacy to achieve partial reform. Second, they clarified the stakes of the struggle. Every victory required not only legal change, but also the dismantling of cultural, economic, and ideological barriers. The persistence of opposition demonstrated how deeply patriarchy was embedded in law, society, and public consciousness. Activists responded by developing multi-pronged strategies They combined legal challenges with public advocacy, moral argumentation, and media campaigns. Pamphlets, essays, and newspaper articles highlighted the human cost of legal exclusion. Public letters and parliamentary petitions created visibility for women's grievances, forcing legislators to confront the consequences of inaction. This combination of legal, social, and moral pressure was essential in overcoming legislative roadblocks, illustrating the complex interplay of activism, law, and public opinion. The decades-long struggle against these roadblocks ultimately culminated in landmark legislation, including the Married Women's Property Acts and reforms in custody law. Each victory, however incremental, represented a breakthrough against the ideological, cultural, and institutional resistance that had long constrained women's rights. Reformers' persistence demonstrated that systemic change required both legal strategy and societal engagement, challenging assumptions about women's capacities and asserting their rightful place as autonomous actors. By examining the arguments used to deny women rights, historians can better understand the depth of the struggle. The claims of natural dependence, economic risk, moral impropriety, legal confusion, and social instability were not neutral or inevitable. They were strategic tools deployed to maintain power. Each obstacle encountered by reformers underscored the need for courage, persistence, and strategic advocacy. Women had to fight not only laws, but centuries of embedded ideology, cultural expectation, and institutional inertia. Ultimately, the legislative roadblocks served to highlight the resilience and ingenuity of Victorian women activists. They demonstrated that persistent challenge, combined with moral, legal, and social argumentation, could gradually dismantle even the most entrenched barriers. Each incremental reform was a testament to decades of struggle, strategic planning, and public advocacy, reflecting the complexity and difficulty of achieving equality in a deeply patriarchal society. The legislative roadblocks of Victorian England, formidable as they were, ultimately failed to prevent women from asserting their rights. They delayed progress, shaped strategies, and highlighted the depth of resistance to gender equality. But they could not extinguish the persistent efforts of reformers determined to secure recognition, autonomy, and justice. The great breakthrough, the Married Women's Property Act of 1882, after decades of struggle, incremental reforms, and persistent advocacy, Victorian women finally witnessed a transformative moment in legal history with the passage of the Married Women's Property Act of 1882. Unlike earlier partial measures, this legislation fundamentally altered the legal status of married women, granting them control over property, earnings, and contractual rights in ways previously unimaginable. The act represented the culmination of decades of activism, public debate, and strategic campaigning, breaking through centuries of legal invisibility and dependency. Before 1882, the doctrine of coverture had dictated that upon marriage, a woman's legal existence was absorbed into her husband's. Any property, money, or assets she brought into the marriage became legally his. Her wages, inheritance, and even any earnings she acquired independently during marriage were his to control. This system left women economically dependent, vulnerable, and powerless. The 1882 Act challenged this foundational principle, recognizing that a married woman could hold property in her own name, make contracts, and retain the rights to her earnings. The significance of the act cannot be overstated. For the first time, a married woman could legally own land, manage investments, or control money she earned through work. She was no longer automatically subject to her husband's financial control. This legal recognition of independence not only altered family dynamics, but also symbolically acknowledged women as autonomous individuals with moral, economic, and social agency. It transformed the married woman from a legally invisible appendage into a legally recognized person. The road to this breakthrough was long and arduous. Activists, like Caroline Norton, who had previously campaigned for custody rights and property protections, laid much of the groundwork. Over decades, reformers utilized multiple strategies: lobbying Parliament, publishing essays and pamphlets, and leveraging sympathetic allies in government and society. They framed property rights not merely as an economic matter, but as a moral and social necessity, demonstrating how the lack of legal recognition harmed families, children, and society at large. The Act itself codified several essential principles. Married women were allowed to keep property brought into the marriage or inherited from family, maintained control over earnings from employment, and exercised rights to contracts and debts in their own name. While there were still limitations particularly concerning certain types of jointly held property, the legislation represented a radical departure from the legal norms of previous centuries. For women across England, this meant practical independence, the ability to manage money, protect inheritance, and make decisions affecting their own lives. Economically, the Act had immediate implications. Women who were skilled artisans, teachers, writers, or entrepreneurs could retain their earnings. This was not only a matter of financial security, but also of personal agency. Controlling their own money allowed women to make independent choices regarding household management, investments, and education for themselves and their children. It fundamentally altered the power dynamics within marriage, giving women tools to assert influence and autonomy within the domestic sphere. The social impact was equally profound. By formally recognizing women as legal individuals with property rights, the Act challenged prevailing cultural notions of female dependency and subordination. It sent a message to society that women were capable of managing assets, participating in economic life, and making rational decisions about their own affairs. This legal validation helped shift social attitudes, slowly eroding centuries of patriarchal assumptions about female incapacity. Politically, the Act demonstrated the effectiveness of sustained activism. Years of lobbying, public advocacy, and strategic alliances within Parliament had finally produced tangible results. Reformers had learned to navigate the legislative process, addressing objections, presenting evidence, and mobilizing public opinion to overcome resistance. The passage of the Act was not only a legal victory, but also a demonstration of women's ability to influence governance and public policy through organized, persistent efforts. The 1882 legislation also had implications for marriage itself. Husbands could no longer automatically claim ownership of their wives' property or earnings, which reshaped marital negotiations and expectations. Women could enter marriage with the assurance that their economic contributions and assets would remain legally their own. This shift allowed women to assert greater agency within domestic relationships, altering traditional power structures and giving them more leverage in family decision-making. For women's rights activists, the Act represented both a victory and a foundation for future reform. While it did not resolve all legal inequalities issues such as voting rights, broader contractual independence, and full social equality remained unaddressed, it established a precedent for challenging legal doctrines that denied women autonomy. It provided a concrete example that sustained advocacy could dismantle deeply entrenched legal and social barriers, inspiring subsequent campaigns in education, suffrage, and employment. The Act's influence extended beyond individual families, affecting communities and society at large. Women who retained property and earnings could contribute economically to their neighborhoods, support charitable causes, and invest in education for children. Legal recognition of their rights transformed not only private lives, but also social networks and public participation, gradually integrating women more fully into civic and economic life. Despite these advances, challenges persisted. Courts and legal institutions took time to interpret and implement the new law consistently. Social attitudes, especially in rural areas or among conservative communities, lagged behind the legal change. Some husbands resisted compliance, attempting to assert control despite the statutory provisions. However, the Act provided women with legal recourse and a framework to assert their rights, representing a critical step toward broader equality. The Married Women's Property Act of 1882 also marked a turning point in public perception of women as citizens with agency by formally acknowledging their economic and legal independence. Society began to recognize women as stakeholders in the legal and economic order. This recognition challenged centuries of patriarchal assumptions, laying the groundwork for broader debates about suffrage, employment, and social participation. In practice, the Act enabled women to protect family wealth, plan for children's futures, and ensure personal security. Widows, single women, and those who remained married could manage estates, engage in business transactions, and retain income without fear of automatic male appropriation. The legislation gave women the practical means to participate fully in economic life, fundamentally altering their social and legal status. For advocates like Caroline Norton, the Act represented the culmination of decades of relentless campaigning. Their strategy combining personal testimony, moral argumentation, and political lobbying demonstrated that incremental reform, persistence, and public visibility could overturn centuries-old legal doctrines. The 1882 Act was both a reward for long-term activism and a validation of women's capacity to influence the law in their favor. Legally, the Act also set a precedent for future reforms in married women's rights. It provided a framework that could be expanded, refined, and applied to other areas of law, including contracts, employment, and inheritance. By establishing that women could possess property, earn income, and exercise legal agency, it created the foundation for a gradual dismantling of coverture and other restrictive doctrines. The cultural impact of the Act cannot be underestimated. For the first time, many women experienced a sense of independence and self-determination sanctioned by law. This recognition fostered confidence, empowerment, and ambition, encouraging women to pursue education, careers, and public engagement. Legal recognition of property rights became a symbol of broader social change, signaling that women's voices and choices mattered in society beyond the domestic sphere. The 1882 breakthrough was, therefore, both practical and symbolic. It transformed women's legal status, reshaped family and marital dynamics, and provided a platform for further social and political activism. It demonstrated that sustained advocacy could overcome entrenched legal doctrines and patriarchal resistance, highlighting the possibility of achieving systemic change through strategic engagement. The Married Women's Property Act of 1880 was a landmark in the history of women's rights, establishing legal recognition of economic and personal autonomy, reshaping societal attitudes, and laying the foundation for future reforms. It was a moment of triumph in a long struggle for equality, signaling that Victorian women could assert both their presence and their agency in a society that had long sought to render them invisible. The power to contract. How 1882 finally created legally real women, The passage of the Married Women's Property Act of 1882 did more than allow women to retain property or earnings. It fundamentally altered the legal status of married women, granting them the ability to act as independent legal entities capable of entering contracts, suing, and being sued. For the first time, the law recognized married women as fully real under the law, capable of owning property in their own name, engaging in commerce, and exercising financial agency without automatic interference from their husbands. This transformation was revolutionary, reshaping not only family dynamics, but also the broader social and economic roles of women in Victorian society. Before 1882, the doctrine of coverture had rendered women legally invisible. A married woman could not sign a contract, hold bank accounts, or pursue business ventures independently. Everything she owned or earned automatically became her husband's property. She was incapable of entering into legal agreements, her existence effectively suspended in the eyes of the law. Any attempt to engage in commerce or financial transactions was legally invalid unless her husband consented or controlled the process. Her autonomy, both economic and legal, was fundamentally denied. The power to contract represented a radical shift. By granting married women the ability to enter into binding legal agreements in their own name, the 1882 Act acknowledged their legal personhood. Women could now borrow money, sign leases, engage in trade, and enter into employment contracts independently. This change was not merely technical. It recognized that women were capable of rational, responsible financial behavior and autonomous legal participation. It was a formal acknowledgement of their individuality and agency. Economically, the ability to contract allowed women to participate more fully in the marketplace. Tradeswomen, entrepreneurs, teachers, writers, and artisans could manage their earnings and property independently, reinvesting income or using it for personal and family purposes. This independence was not just practical, but transformative, enabling women to gain financial literacy, control resources, and influence family and community decisions. Economic agency became a powerful instrument of personal empowerment and social influence. The act also had significant implications for marriage. Husbands could no longer automatically control every financial and legal decision made by their wives. Married women, for the first time, had legal recourse if their husbands attempted to interfere with contracts or seize property. This change gradually altered domestic power dynamics, creating space for negotiation, independence, and mutual respect within households. Women's decisions could carry legal weight, and their voices in family matters could no longer be dismissed outright. Socially, the recognition of women as legal entities capable of contracting challenged deeply entrenched cultural norms. Victorian society had long portrayed women as dependent, emotional, and incapable of rational judgment in financial matters. By enabling women to contract independently, the law validated their capacity for reasoned decision-making, intellectual competence, and moral responsibility. It signaled a slow but profound shift in public perception, demonstrating that women could function as autonomous agents in both private and public spheres. Legally, the power to contract represented a breakthrough in the recognition of women's personhood. Before 1882, women were treated as extensions of their husbands. The law assumed that their consent, labor, and property were inseparable from their husband's authority. The Act severed this automatic legal dependency, granting women the ability to make binding decisions in their own right. This legal autonomy opened doors to greater participation in education, employment, commerce, and civic life. Women were no longer invisible actors in the legal system. they became real, accountable, and recognized individuals. For women navigating Victorian society, this transformation was both empowering and practical. They could now enter into agreements for education, employment, and housing. Women could negotiate terms of trade, hire staff, rent property, and participate in financial networks without relying on male intermediaries. This independence not only enhanced personal security, but also expanded opportunities for social mobility, professional development, and public engagement. It allowed women to step beyond domestic confines and engage with the broader world on their own terms. The legal recognition of contractual power also had symbolic importance. By granting women the authority to act independently in law, the act challenged the notion that women were naturally subordinate. It demonstrated that legal equality, even if partial, could codify social recognition of women's capacity and agency. For reformers, the ability to contract was emblematic of broader goals: full legal recognition, economic independence, and social dignity. It validated decades of activism and offered a concrete example of how law could reshape society. The impact extended to families as well. Women who controlled contracts and property could manage household finances, pay for children's education, and protect family wealth. This autonomy enabled more equitable decision-making within marriages and reduced the economic vulnerability of women and children. It shifted the domestic balance, creating room for collaboration and mutual respect rather than unilateral male authority. For many families, the change meant a redefinition of domestic and economic roles that had previously been rigidly gendered. Activists leveraged this newfound legal power to advance further reforms. Women could now enter business transactions, own property independently, and engage in economic activities that were previously barred. These opportunities strengthened advocacy for educational, professional, and political rights, as women demonstrated their competence and responsibility in public and private affairs. The power to contract became a stepping stone toward broader equality, providing tangible evidence that legal recognition could translate into practical autonomy. The act's effect on society was also cultural. As women began exercising legal and economic agency, perceptions of female capability gradually shifted. Observers saw that women could manage property, negotiate agreements, and participate responsibly in economic life. This real-world demonstration countered long-standing stereotypes of female weakness, irrationality, and dependency. By asserting legal and contractual authority, women claimed visibility and respect, challenging centuries of legal and social marginalization. Economically, the ability to contract allowed women to protect their interests and accumulate resources independently. They could invest in businesses, lend or borrow money, and manage estates without interference. This independence fostered a new class of women who were economically self-sufficient and socially influential. The act did not merely prevent exploitation. It created opportunities for empowerment, growth, and societal contribution. Women became active participants in economic networks, contributing to local economies and public life. The transformation also highlighted the interplay between law and activism. Achieving the power to contract required decades of persistent lobbying, public awareness campaigns, and legal argumentation. Reformers had two counter-entrenched ideologies: legislative opposition and cultural resistance. The success of the 1882 Act demonstrated that sustained advocacy, strategic argumentation, and public engagement could overcome centuries of systemic discrimination, setting a precedent for future reforms. In practical terms, The power to contract provided women with tools for personal security. Legal independence meant that a married woman could protect her assets from spousal mismanagement, debts, or insolvency. She could engage in financial transactions without fear that her husband could nullify agreements or claim sole ownership. This security was not merely economic. It was psychological and social, affirming her status as a legally recognized, autonomous individual capable of making responsible decisions. The recognition of contractual authority also intersected with other legal reforms, including custody rights and property ownership. Women could now combine legal control of property with maternal influence, strengthening their position within families and society. This intersection reinforced the broader principle of legal recognition. Women were no longer passive appendages to men, but fully accountable, autonomous actors in law, family, and public life. The Married Women's Property Act of 1882, by granting the power to contract, marked the culmination of decades of advocacy. It validated the persistent struggle of reformers, illustrated the possibility of systemic change, and transformed the lived experience of women in Victorian England. By finally creating legally real women, the Act reshaped family dynamics, economic participation, and social expectations. It was a breakthrough that empowered women to act independently, protect their interests, and assert their legal and moral agency in ways previously impossible. The 1882 Act, through the recognition of contractual power, established the principle that women were legal individuals with agency, capable of participating fully in law, commerce, and society. It represented a critical milestone in the long struggle for equality, signaling that Victorian women were no longer legally invisible but real, recognized, and empowered actors in their own right. A global context, comparing the timeline to American and world history. By the late 19th century, the legal recognition of women's rights in Victorian England, particularly through the Married Women's Property Act of 1882, marked a milestone in the broader global movement for gender equality. Yet while England had achieved this breakthrough, it existed within a complex international context where the pace of reform varied dramatically. Comparing the English timeline with developments in the United States and other countries reveals both the unique nature of Victorian reform and the universality of women's struggles against legal and social subordination. In England, decades of activism had gradually dismantled the rigid structures of coverture. Legal reforms in custody, property, and contractual rights were incremental, reflecting the cautious pragmatism of Victorian society. Reformers like Caroline Norton and others had leveraged public advocacy, parliamentary lobbying, and social discourse to effect change. By 1882, married women could legally own property, retain earnings, and enter into contracts independently, representing a significant shift in their legal and social status. These victories were the result of decades-long campaigns that balanced strategic legal argumentation with moral and public persuasion. Across the Atlantic, women in the United States faced a parallel but distinct struggle. American women, particularly in the northern states, were advocating for property rights, suffrage, and legal recognition during the same period. States such as New York, Massachusetts, and Illinois began passing married women's property acts in the mid-to-late-1800s, granting women limited rights to own property and manage earnings. Similar to England, these reforms were incremental and often constrained by class, geography, and local social norms. While England had created a comprehensive national framework with the 1882 Act, in the U.S., property rights were largely state, creating a patchwork of legal protections for women. The American context also highlighted the intersection of gender, race, and class. While wealthy white women could often leverage property rights and social networks to secure autonomy, women of color and poor women faced systemic barriers that limited the impact of legal reforms. Discrimination, economic vulnerability, and limited access to legal resources meant that the promise of legal recognition often remained theoretical rather than practical. England faced similar inequalities, particularly affecting working-class women. But the U.S. struggle added the additional dimension of racial injustice, complicating the fight for universal gender equality. Globally, the struggle for women's rights in the late 19th century was part of a broader pattern of legal and social reform. In continental Europe, reforms varied widely. Countries such as France, Germany, and Italy had entrenched patriarchal legal systems influenced by Napoleonic or local civil codes, which often limited women's property rights and legal independence. In France, for example, married women remained largely subordinate under the Napoleonic Code, which emphasized male authority in marriage, property, and legal affairs. Reforms were gradual and piecemeal, and it would take decades for broader legal recognition to emerge. In Scandinavian countries, reform often came earlier or in more progressive forms. Sweden, for instance, had begun recognizing certain legal rights for women in the mid-1800s, allowing limited property ownership and contractual authority. Norway and Denmark followed similar paths, creating a legal environment in which women could gradually participate in economic and civic life. These nations illustrate that the trajectory of reform was uneven, influenced by cultural, political, and social factors rather than chronological inevitability. The English experience also resonated in the colonies and dominions of the British Empire. In Australia, Canada, and New Zealand, debates about married women's property rights reflected the tension between local governance and inherited English law. New Zealand, for example, became a pioneer in women's rights, granting property rights to married women and eventually extending suffrage, culminating in the world's first national vote for women in 1893. These developments demonstrate how legal reform in England influenced colonial legal systems while also adapting to local conditions and social movements. Comparing timelines further underscores the global persistence of patriarchal legal structures. In many parts of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, women remained legally subordinate well into the 20th century. Customary law, religious codes, and colonial legal frameworks often denied women property rights, marital autonomy, and economic independence. While England's 1882 Act was groundbreaking in its legal scope, it existed in a global landscape where gender inequality remained deeply entrenched. Victorian reformers were part of a larger, interconnected struggle, providing models, inspiration, and evidence that legal change was possible. The transnational perspective also highlights the role of activism, media, and networks in advancing women's rights. English reformers corresponded with counterparts in America, Europe, and the colonies, sharing strategies, legal arguments, and case studies. Journals, pamphlets, and newspapers circulated internationally, spreading awareness of legal reforms and exposing injustices. This global exchange helped create momentum for change, linking local struggles to a broader narrative of women's rights and illustrating the universality of the challenges faced by women. Economic changes also influenced reform worldwide. The Industrial Revolution, urbanization, and the rise of wage labor created new opportunities for women, but also exposed vulnerabilities in traditional legal frameworks. Women who worked outside the home needed legal protection for their earnings and property across England, the US, and parts of Europe. The push for property rights and contractual autonomy was directly linked to these economic transformations. Legal reform was thus not only a moral or social imperative, but a response to changing economic realities that demanded recognition of women as active participants in society. Education emerged as another critical factor in global reform. As women gained access to schools, universities, and professional training, the argument that they were incapable of managing property or contracts became increasingly untenable. Literacy, financial knowledge, and professional skills provided evidence of competence, strengthening the case for legal and social equality. In England, these educational advancements supported the implementation and acceptance of reforms like the 1882 Act. In the US and Europe, they bolstered campaigns for property rights, suffrage, and professional inclusion. The global context also illustrates the interplay between law and culture. Legal recognition alone was insufficient to ensure equality. Social norms, cultural beliefs, and economic structures had to evolve in tandem. Even where legislation granted rights, women often faced resistance in practice. Husbands, courts, employers, and communities could obstruct women's autonomy, showing that the enactment of law was only one step in a broader struggle for meaningful empowerment. Yet, the achievements of England and its influence abroad provided models for hope and strategy by demonstrating that legal doctrines like coverture could be overturned and that married women could be recognized as independent legal entities. England offered proof that systemic reform was possible. Activists in America, New Zealand, and other parts of the world drew on these examples, framing their own campaigns with reference to the English experience. The victories of Victorian women, therefore, had international resonance, inspiring parallel movements and providing tangible evidence that decades of struggle could yield concrete results. By the turn of the century, women's legal status across the globe was beginning to shift, though unevenly. In England, the groundwork laid by the 1882 Act set the stage for further property and contractual reforms. In the United States, state-level property laws were being expanded and campaigns for suffrage were gaining strength. In other parts of Europe and the colonies, debates about women's legal and social recognition. The Victorian timeline thus fits into a larger narrative of global reform, incremental, contested, and interconnected across nations and cultures. The English experience also underscores the importance of sustained advocacy and strategic action. Legal breakthroughs like the 1882 Act were not inevitable. They resulted from decades of persistent effort, careful negotiation, and the courage of women who risked social ostracism to demand recognition. This lesson resonated worldwide. Meaningful reform required both public visibility and legal strategy, linking local activism to broader movements for justice and equality. Ultimately, comparing the English timeline to American and world history highlights both the uniqueness and universality of women's struggles. While England achieved a comprehensive legal milestone with the 1882 Act, women everywhere faced systemic barriers to recognition, autonomy, and equality. Victorian reforms were both inspirational and instructive, illustrating that legal and social change is possible but requires persistent effort, strategic advocacy, and a willingness to challenge deeply embedded norms. The global context of women's legal reform demonstrates that while England's 1882 breakthrough was significant, it was part of a worldwide struggle for recognition, autonomy, and justice. By comparing timelines, strategies, and outcomes, we see both the progress achieved and the challenges that remained, revealing the interconnected nature of women's fight for equality across nations and generations. Conclusion: what we owe to the women who refused to be erased. The story of Victorian women's struggle for legal, economic, and social recognition is ultimately a testament to resilience, courage, and persistence. Across decades, women faced laws designed to render them invisible, social norms that confined them to domesticity, and cultural narratives that questioned their intelligence, morality, and autonomy. Yet, despite these formidable obstacles, countless women refused to accept erasure. They fought, argued, wrote, petitioned, and organized, asserting their existence in a society that often sought to deny it. Their struggle was not merely for personal gain, it was a fight for recognition, dignity, and justice that would lay the groundwork for generations to come. From the earliest campaigns against coverture and property restrictions to the dramatic victories of the Married Women's Property Acts, these women challenged the very foundations of a patriarchal legal system. Figures like Caroline Norton exemplified the courage required to speak truth to power. Her public advocacy, grounded in personal experience and moral clarity, illustrated the human cost of legal invisibility and sparked a movement that would eventually transform English law. Norton and others demonstrated that change was possible when courage, strategy, and persistence converged. The victories of Victorian reformers were both symbolic and practical. Legal recognition of property rights, contractual authority, and custody reforms transformed women's lives in tangible ways. For the first time, married women could own property, manage earnings, and engage in legal agreements without requiring a husband's consent. They could assert control over family wealth, make decisions about their own labor, and claim legal agency in a system that had long denied them such autonomy. Every incremental legal advancement not only protected women economically and socially, but also reshaped the moral and cultural perception of their capacities. Yet, the story of progress was never linear. For every legislative victory, there remained resistance, loopholes, and societal obstacles. Laws were often unevenly enforced. Courts interpreted statutes inconsistently, and cultural attitudes were slow to change. Women continued to face practical limitations, social ostracism, and economic vulnerabilities. The fight for recognition was not a single moment of triumph, but a continuous effort that required resilience across decades. It was the persistence of countless women, many unnamed and that gradually eroded centuries of legal and social oppression. The courage of these women provides enduring lessons. Their struggle reminds us that legal recognition is inseparable from social visibility and moral acknowledgement. They showed that activism requires both intellect and emotion, combining strategic understanding of the law with the moral power of lived experience. By challenging injustice openly, they forced society to confront uncomfortable truths, that denying women legal rights was not only unjust, but harmful to families, communities, and social progress. Moreover, these Victorian campaigns highlight the importance of storytelling and historical memory. The records, letters, and testimonies of women who fought for property, custody, and contractual rights preserve the narrative of resistance. They serve as a reminder that social transformation is rooted in human stories, the lived experiences of those who dare to challenge the structures of power. in honoring their struggles. We affirm that history is shaped not only by the laws enacted, but by the courage of individuals who demand recognition and refuse to be erased. The impact of their struggle resonates beyond Victorian England. Across the globe, women have drawn inspiration from these early campaigns, recognizing that legal recognition is both a tool and a symbol of autonomy. The victories of the 19th century laid the foundation for the broader movements of the 20th and 21st centuries, including suffrage, labor rights, educational access, and political representation. Every step toward equality has been built upon the courage of those who refuse to remain invisible under the law. As we reflect on this history, it is clear that the fight for recognition was not merely about laws on paper, it was about affirming human dignity. Victorian women's struggle teaches us that agency, identity, and legal rights are intertwined. Erasing one aspect of a person's life, property, voice, custody, or labor can erase their very existence. By reclaiming these rights, women asserted not only legal authority, but the fundamental truth of their humanity. They refused to be reduced to objects of property, passive actors in domestic spaces, or invisible figures in legal documents. Today, we owe a debt to these women not only in gratitude, but in responsibility. Their struggles remind us to remain vigilant against legal, social, and cultural structures that attempt to silence or marginalize. They teach us that justice is hard-won and requires persistent effort, advocacy, and courage. They show us that each generation inherits the work of those before it, building on victories while confronting continuing inequalities. Recognizing their legacy means both honoring their achievements and continuing the work of dismantling barriers to equality and autonomy wherever they persist. In the end, the story of Victorian women is a story of refusal to accept invisibility, a refusal to accept legal erasure, and a refusal to allow society to define their worth. Their courage, persistence, and ingenuity created the conditions for legal recognition, social respect, and economic autonomy. They remind us that change is possible even in the face of entrenched power, and that progress is the product of collective, sustained effort. We remember them not as victims of a bygone era, but as architects of justice, whose determination forged pathways for generations of women to live as fully recognized individuals. Their legacy is woven into the very fabric of modern society, echoing in laws, rights, and cultural norms that continue to evolve. In honoring them, we affirm that no one should be erased, and that the fight for recognition, legal, social, and moral is both a historical achievement and an ongoing responsibility. The women of Victorian England who refused to be erased serve as both a mirror and a beacon, a mirror reflecting the injustices of the past, and a beacon guiding the work of equality in the present and future. They teach us that courage, persistence, and moral clarity can transform societies, reshape laws, and reclaim human dignity. Their stories, struggles, and triumphs remind us that recognition is not granted lightly. It is demanded, fought for, and ultimately earned through relentless advocacy, unwavering determination, and the refusal to be silenced. And so, the history of Victorian women's fight for rights closes not with an end, but with a legacy of courage, resilience, and the undeniable truth that those who refuse to be erased can change the world. One law, one voice, and one victory at a time.